From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. March 1, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WCW ratings cause panic. Super Brawl review. Plus tons of news. By Observer staff. After the biggest gap in the history of the Monday night ratings on February 15, WCW went into its own version of a panic attack with morale hitting rock bottom. Everyone was pointing fingers everywhere, as when the ratings came in nobody could any longer pretend the new concept of pro wrestling television started one week featuring bad mini-movies that the announcers live don't see was a success. But when the ratings came back on February 22, when WCW went back to a more traditional show, bottoming out only when they did the NWO satellite takeover of the show, the ratings bounced back to the level they had been most of this year, with Raw still solidly ahead, but Nitro's ratings at least no being the embarrassment they were the week before. On February 15, Raw drew 6,492,000 viewers, to Nitro's 3,851,500 viewers over the head-to-head 2 hours. Raw captured 72% of males 18 to 24, 56% of males 25 to 54, 55% of males 55 plus, 66% of females 18 to 24, 57% of females 25 to 54, 40% of females 55 plus, the only demographic Nitro won, 72% of kids and 77% of teenagers. It was the biggest whitewash in the history of the Monday ratings. Even though Raw drew its all-time record audience, the audience was only slightly above what Raw had been doing in recent weeks. Any study of the ratings shows that the gap was because Nitro was so unwatchable and not because Raw was so great, even though the Rock vs. Mankind ladder match that headlined the show was an excellent match and there were good angles throughout. Raw did a record 5.90 rating, 6.10 first hour, 5.72 seconds hour, and 8.7 share to Nitro's 3.90 rating, 4.70 first hour, 3.37 seconds hour, 3.65 third hour. It was the highest rating either company had done in a competitive situation in history. With the exception of one segment, the Hulk Hogan vs. Roddy Piper match which drew a 5.0, still losing to the 5.1 for the Shane McMahon and Kane vs. Triple H and X-Pac match which was as close as it ever got. Nitro spent almost the entire show below what was believed to be its 3.5 base, the audience that was considered the lowest WCW could go if every swing vote was going WWF's way, bottoming end with 3.0 segments, one being a bunch of recap clips and the other being the finish of the Benoit and Malenko vs. Scotty Riggs and Mike Enos match and the beginning of an NWO Wolfpack interview while everyone waited for Flair to arrive. February 22 was back to the normal gap, with Raw actually drawing more viewers 6,508,000 than the previous week even though the rating dropped slightly, due to an amazing 15% increase in children 11 and under watching the show which didn't amount to more households, it just meant more people per household were watching than ever before. We should point out a few weeks ago when talking about Raw's content saying that the second hour of Raw was the most watched hour among 11 and under kids of every wrestling hour during the week, and over the past 2 weeks it has actually been the first hour of Raw, followed by the second hour of Raw. Although the second hour of Raw on February 22 drew an amazing 3.5 rating which is a 23 audience share in that age group. Nitro drew a healthy 5,274,000 viewers, a huge increase over the previous week, with huge pickups among kids and teenagers in particular. When it came to kids and teenagers, the combined two shows drew a 6.2 rating and 30.5 share among kids and an 11.8 rating and 34.5 share among teenagers. For traditional numbers, Raw did a 5.55 rating, 5.58 first hour, 5.53 seconds hour, and a 8.3 share to Nitro's 4.73 rating, 5.06 first hour, 4.42 seconds hour, 4.71 third hour, and 7.0 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Nitro did a 4.56 rating so it was in actuality a full 1 point gap head-to-head. Nitro peaked with 4.9 ratings for both the Nash vs. Mysterio Jr. and Conan video quarter, and for the Miller vs. Norton and beginning of Steiner vs. Goldberg quarters, although Raw still won both quarters handily with a 5.6, tease of Rock vs. White with Mankind ref and Blackman vs. Draws, and 5.5, Holly vs. Bart Gunn. Raw peaked with a 6.1 for Ken Shamrock vs. Billy Gunn and the Sable interview. The final quarter hour saw Raw's X-Pac vs. China and beginning of Undertaker vs. Kane Inferno match doing a 5.5 to Nitro's ending of Goldberg vs. Steiner and Nitro Girls Bikini Video doing a 4.5. I'd bet the house the margin was far closer during the early part of the segment and died when the Nitro Girls were on. WCW got destroyed in the overrun, putting on that NWO takeover of the set gimmick. After spending the entire show teasing a Ric Flair-David Flair confrontation, Rick was actually back home in Charlotte because his father was ill and was never going to appear, doing a 3.8 while Undertaker Kane's finish did a 6.5. Hopefully the WCW booking team will learn about content placement from the last 15 minutes or so of the show. Nitro changed its format slightly, although still had a lot of cameras everywhere skits, but now allow the announcers to see what the viewer at home sees. It also focused more on the in-ring, building up real matches as opposed to pushing Bret Hart vs. Will Sasso as its biggest match the previous week, and even presented its best television match in a long time with a clean finish as Booker T pinned Hart in 1745, which did a 5.4 unopposed and 4.3 opposed quarter. The finger pointing went everywhere after the February 15th show and rumors were flying to make morale worse. As the story went, at least as believed by many of the wrestlers, there was a booking meeting on February 16th in Tampa, true, and what was said was to have been plans to bury certain wrestlers, in particular Bret Hart, Roddy Piper, Conan, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Raven, Canyon, Chris Jericho and Bam Bam Bigelow for various reasons. Hart and Nash came out of a previous booking meeting with heat and Nash tried to get word out that Hart wasn't a team player. The burying of Hart would have to be careful because Bischoff still wants to push Hogan vs. Hart for Halloween Havoc, feeling he needs to get some value out of all the money he's paying Hart, while Nash doesn't want to push Hart feeling he's not over. And apparently Bischoff truly understands so little about wrestling that the idea that Hart jobs for the likes of Booker T or Chris Benoit is believed to have no correlation to his ability to draw in a pay-per-view main event against Hogan. Benoit and Malenko have been called vanilla midgets, and are clearly being programmed in a manner to make sure they don't get over as well. It's said their burial can't be as obvious, which it hasn't been, because Bischoff did promise both of them pushes but he's clearly had it whispered in his ear by Hogan and Nash that both are too small to be serious headliners, and in the case of Malenko, I'd agree he was better off in the cruiserweight division but Benoit's work is so believable he can be taken seriously with anyone. It was Nash who got in Goldberg's ear about killing the Goldberg-Jericho program before it ever really got started, pointing to Jericho's size, and at this point there's a lot of fear that Jericho will jump when his contract expires in July if the WWF even gives him an offer in the ballpark to WCW's offer. Bigelow didn't get over despite the big push when coming in, and there's still a lot of heat from the time that Bigelow and Shane Douglas wouldn't let Scott Hall into backstage when he arrived with his friend Justin Credible at an ECW house show in Hall's hometown of Orlando, which also stems from years earlier when the clique ruled the WWF and Bigelow, coming off the LT loss, was supposed to get a big face push and things were done to make sure in that situation he didn't get over as well. Piper has a big name, but is seen as having nothing left, and it appears Conan has an underlying issue with Lex Luger, who has become a close Nash ally for various reasons, which has him somewhat in the doghouse politically. It's also clear that everything done over the past 2 weeks has been done to kill Flair, particularly taking the beating on Monday and having to job on the Sunday pay-per-view, presented to an unhappy Flair in the guise of him doing something to help his son get over. There is also finger-pointing among the big three in power: Hogan, Bischoff, and Nash. Diamond Dallas Page, while still having power based on being friends with Bischoff, is clearly losing ground both when it comes to popularity, due to misreading the current landscape, and a reputation that his booking ideas are usually only for himself and his friends rather than spread across everyone. Of course the same could be said for Nash. Bischoff has missed several recent television tapings, causing wrestlers to note that Vince McMahon would never do the same, concentrating his time of late on working in Hollywood. There are many in the company who think Bischoff devoting more time to non-wrestling activities may be him creating a safety net to save face and jump off if ratings start to fall. Those close to Nash claim he considers this like Vietnam, an unwinnable war, because even though he's been given full say on most aspects of television, he has little say-so on the main angles which involve Hogan. Hogan is still seen by everyone as making WCW his personal vehicle for whatever he wants to do to get personally over, and holding down younger wrestlers who can work so the style on top stays easy enough for him to hang, which, unfortunately, dooms the company because the public has switched to WWF in droves largely because of weaknesses in the WCW product due to not only weaker storylines, but the perception it's an old man company. There's also always the age-old problem of his historical battle with Flair by portraying him as the one whose act is from another era and who always gets vanquished by Hogan in the end, which has resulted in the entire Carolinas region, the last WCW stronghold largely being strongly pro-WWF due to the constant frustration over the impotence of the Horsemen. Nevertheless, among the wrestlers, Nash seems to be taking the brunt of the heat with the belief that the new WCW version of the Clique, Nash, Hogan, Scott Hall, Scott Steiner and Buff Bagwell are going to be pushed and protected, and with the exception of a few others like perhaps Bryan Adams, Disco Inferno and Perry Saturn, nobody is going to get a chance for elevation. People like Billy Kidman and Juventud Guerrera, who were the top performers in the company for the past several months, have been almost completely eliminated from television, thereby eliminating the WCW advantage of being able to present a stronger in-ring product, and the push for the stronger workers has been stopped cold in favor of bigger and older slugs. While Nash did the television job for Rey Mysterio Jr. as his way to set the example to get everyone to lose clean when asked, and lip service to pushing the smallest guy in the company after taking his mask for no storyline purpose, many saw through it, noting that nobody will take that loss seriously because the match, which actually came across about as good as almost could have been possible, looked stupid due to that size difference. But in a world where every idea and theory changes every Tuesday afternoon, all it takes is a few good shows to put WCW back in serious competition, and even the worst show seems to only create 1 week's worth of damage. But with the NBA playoffs upcoming, which will preempt Nitro for several weeks and lead to WWF ratings in the mid-sixes, and the flood of mainstream ink, McMahon will be getting both positive and negative over the next 2 months and probable record revenues from WrestleMania. He himself seems to be the media story of the month rather than the wrestling war. In that battle, despite its questionable content, WWF is the wrestling everyone is talking about, and WCW is the sanitized second-place group, and ECW isn't even playing the game. Perhaps the greatest competitive wrestler who ever lived, and certainly the most successful, Alexander Karelin, the Russian nicknamed The Experiment, probably not for anything he has done himself in laboratories or food supplements he's experimented with, an 11-time world Greco-Roman champion and 3-time Olympic gold medalist who hasn't been beaten in any form of competition in more than 12 years, headlined his first pro wrestling event on February 21st at the Yokohama Arena for the Rings organization. There are things known about the match. Karelin, 31, won a decision via a 2-1 point score over Akira Maeda in a 2 5-minute round match. Maeda, 39, a pro wrestling legend in Japan who retired before a packed house in the same arena in July, came out of retirement for the main event of the biggest rings show in history before a sellout 17,048 fans, paying an estimated $2,479,000, which probably rivals only the Muhammad Ali vs. Antonio Inoki match in 1976 as the largest gate for a traditional arena, as opposed to a domed stadium, in the history of pro wrestling. The match was considered a major success both financially for the company, which has been struggling at the gate since Maeda's retirement due to its top 2 remaining stars, Kiyoshi Tamura and Tsuyoshi Kosaka, despite their talent, not breaking through and becoming pro wrestling drawing cards. The appearance of Karelin garnered incredible publicity both within the wrestling and martial arts world of Japan, but also as a top sports story, as it received major coverage on every network sports segment and got 6 full pages of coverage the next day in Tokyo Sports, unprecedented for pro wrestling in years. The question among insiders going into the match, and still coming out of it, was what exactly was the match? Apparently this has become a hotly debated issue among wrestling fans on the internet in Japan, as to whether this was a shoot or worked match. We should have a complete review of the show from videotape hopefully by next week, if not the week after. The general consensus among those there live is it was a shoot match, but perhaps with agreed upon stipulations beforehand, which is not unusual for shoot matches in that organization, perhaps limiting some forms of striking. There is natural skepticism due to Maeda's background. Reports from those live indicate the match had no holes, spots in work shoots where it becomes noticeable that the combatants are working together, which would be almost impossible in a work since Maeda in numerous worked shoots has never had a match without holes against far more experienced workers. Only the very best rings workers, a category Maeda doesn't fit into, against one another, can do a worked match without holes if this truly didn't have any holes. It is ridiculous to believe Karelin, never having done this before, could pull off a work that would be believable, especially since he wasn't in the country long enough to practice it out ahead of time, which is common practice in worked matches with people who had never done this before. That doesn't rule out a shoot with one person carrying the other to the time limit instead of working to finish them, although Karelin would probably not be experienced enough at that aspect of holding back in competition without that also becoming evident watching the match. Karelin himself never threw one blow, but dominated, throwing Maeda around like a rag doll for most of the bout. But realistically, in a striking match, he would have lost, so it served him no purpose to even try and do something he was unfamiliar with simply because the rules allowed it, when his strengths would not have been attempting to throw blows, but in using his power to throw his opponent around, although he could have done open hands while in the mount, but perhaps that was pre-match agreement in regard to agreement on what rules the match would be held under. And even striking on the ground could give Maeda an opening to get a submission. Maeda had never done a real match in his legendary career. The closest he came were two legendary pro wrestling matches which broke down into anarchy, a 1985 match against Satoru Sayama and a 1986 match with Andre the Giant. With no reputation needed to protect since he was retired and had no intention of coming back after this match due to persistent knee problems, it is conceivable he would have, for the good of his company, done a shoot match. All Japanese media covered this match as if it was legitimate, which isn't necessarily the seal of approval, but that is how it was handled. It isn't conceivable Maeda should have done shoot matches during his active career, for he was not a world-class shooter in reality but was the company's big drawing card and needed to be protected for the survival of the company. Because he had retired, protecting his reputation wasn't necessary for future business as it had been in the past, and nobody would hold it against him to lose to Karelin under any situation, who most wrestling and martial arts reporters after the match believed was the most powerful man they had ever seen in any form of combat competition. Maeda trained under Karl Gotch at the New Japan Dojo and later for the original UWF in submissions, and had a strong karate background as a teenager before being recruited by New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1977. Among fighters familiar with Maeda, and knew of Karelin only through reputation, was that as a pure wrestler, Karelin was a military champion in Samba as a teenager and boxed as a young child, and since the match could only end via knockout or submission, that if it was a shoot, and those involved in training Maeda insisted from the start it was going to be, even though most others were skeptical due to Maeda never being in one before, citing that and his age and the ungodly physical power of his opponent, it would end with either Maeda hooking Karelin if he got tired or made a mistake, since Karelin is used to matches under far shorter time limits in international Greco-Roman rules, or Karelin throwing him around like a rag doll but not finishing him. However, Karelin has injured foes in Greco-Roman wrestling with his famed Karelin lift, basically a shoot version of the pro wrestling Dr. Bomb, and did have the power to perhaps knock Maeda out with it a throw, although that was unlikely, or injure him, which was far more likely. 10 minutes was considered too short of a time limit to give Maeda a strong shot at winning, and Maeda's stamina would have been suspect in a long match as well, because he's never been in top shape in years and was inexperienced at this level of competition. He'd be expected to take tremendous punishment being thrown around until he could hook him or catch him with a kick. The first round opened with Maeda throwing kicks and going for a takedown, which sounds ridiculous because it had 0% chance of success. Karelin blocked it and injured Maeda's neck in the process. Karelin threw Maeda around for a while, but Maeda caught Karelin's ankle midway through the first round and scored a point, which may have been with a half Boston Crab, when Karelin made the ropes. Karelin used his Karelin lift late in the round, further damaging Maeda's neck. In the second round, Karelin dominated, gaining rope break points with a headlock choke and with an armbar, which has to be a surprise, Karelin even getting Maeda into a submission position. At one point early in the round, Maeda did get Karelin's back momentarily but was unable to secure a choke. The 2 points meant Karelin was the winner when time expired. The match was said to have been more exciting than most expected it would be, particularly since the earlier shoot matches on the show were dull and that the vast majority of the match saw Karelin dominating Maeda, holding him on the ground in mount position with Maeda unable to handle the power and move. Maeda did get some low kicks in before being taken down a few times in the fight. Maeda had to be helped from the ring due to the damage he had suffered. After the match, Karelin stated that he was tense and uneasy about fighting this style for the first time. He said he was lucky to be near the ropes when Maeda got his ankle or he would have had to tap. He said his strategy was to wear Maeda down in the first round and go for a finish in the second round, but that he got tired faster than he expected and couldn't finish Maeda, although Maeda appeared to be more tired than Karelin. He said he was satisfied with a win in his first match under these rules but suffered some damage from leg kicks, which concerned him because he's competing in the Russian National Championships next week and the World Championships in June. He said he wouldn't return to rings at any time in the near future. He said to continue to fight this style, he would have to train for the sport, and at this point all his training is geared toward winning a 4th gold medal at the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, Australia. He hinted that he would consider returning after the Olympics. Of the remaining 3 major matches on the show, 2 were definitely shoots and another was a work. Kiyoshi Tamura avenged a major loss in a shoot match last year to Valentin Overeem to an extent, winning in 6:08 with an armbar in a match which was a work this time out. Most likely Tamura won't be doing another shoot match until his April 23rd match in Osaka against Frank Shamrock, which was officially announced to the crowd at this card. It was also announced at this show that on March 23 at Tokyo Bay NK Hall there would be a Vale Tudo rules match with Randy Couture, the former UFC heavyweight champion, facing Soviet Ilyakhin Mikhail. Rings had been attempting at various times to book a rematch between the Tamura and Overeem of Holland after Overeem destroyed Tamura, injuring his ankle badly in the process 1 year ago. The rematch would have had to have been a work because in hindsight it turned out to be such a major mistake, risking Tamura's reputation and health in a shoot against a much larger and younger opponent who was both a dangerous striker and quick on the ground in submissions. In the shoot matches, giant Ricardo Moraes, 6'8", 280, of Brazil won by a decision in a boring match over Hiromitsu Kaniara, 5'6", 213, a far more technical fighter simply giving away too much size. And Rings fighter Wataru Sakata also lost a boring decision match to Brazilian Vale Tudo fighter Sean Alvarez. In a situation described by owner Paul Heyman as the company literally being days or weeks from folding due to running out of money, ECW made deals this past week which Heyman proclaimed puts the company in better financial position than it has been at any time over the past year. Heyman secured a $750,000 loan, basically using revenue the company has yet to receive from the past two pay-per-view events, from Quantum Financing on February 20th, which he said would solve the current short-term cash flow problems caused by the company running out of money, and enable payroll to be met and all checks to clear. Heyman said he couldn't get a traditional bank loan to keep the company financially afloat while waiting for pay-per-view revenue to come in because of the risk of missing a payment, and the bank being able to confiscate company assets that could leave the company once again in a precarious position. The bigger deal was a co-promotional deal on pay-per-view shows with Buena Vista Television, a Disney subsidiary. Earlier in the week Heyman was hoping to get Buena Vista to buy into ECW in an ownership capacity, but Heyman said the deal agreed upon is Buena Vista would be partners in pay-per-view, television ad sales and syndication as opposed to partners in the company as a whole. Heyman said the agreed upon deal is that starting with the May 16th pay-per-view show, that Buena Vista would pay all upfront costs of producing the pay-per-view shows. ECW has been spending approximately $250,000 upfront on its pay-per-view shows, although production upgrades would naturally upgrade the costs, and spend in excess of $100,000 on promotion and marketing of the shows. In addition, Viewers' Choice Canada will begin airing ECW on pay-per-view starting with that show. When the pay-per-view money comes in, Buena Vista will receive the money first, taking out all of their expenses, and also receiving a major cut of any increased revenue from pay-per-view above the current 0.24 buy rate level. In addition, ECW, which had signed licensing rights to THQ for $100,000, which ended up going nowhere since the company made dealings with Yak's Toys, which markets WWF, and deals proposed where WWF would take over control of ECW's licensing were never finalized. Heyman claims because he feared the potential of WWF being in control of ECW's licensing when the two companies could be considered competitors in the same market. Heyman claimed that his lawyers went to THQ this past week and told them that without upfront money and an outside licensing deal that the company would be out of business by the end of February and the licensing rights would be worthless, and THQ agreed to put the rights up for auction, along with receiving a hefty share of the money above and beyond their own initial expenditure. ECW was literally days away from losing several key pieces of talent, including its entire international contingent, if checks didn't clear this week. Apparently a few of the Inner Circle wrestlers had charged significant amount of travel expenses on their personal credit cards and were owed money on that. It is believed that no wrestlers have received pay-per-view bonuses in several months. Amidst the fallout from all the rubble, WCW presented on February 21st at the Oakland Arena. The show was largely decent from a work rate standpoint, but it was clear going in that finishes were designed more to bury potential stars than elevate and create new ones, which is exactly what WCW doesn't need these days. The show drew a sellout 15,880 paying $550,651 and another $118,455 in merchandise, selling out weeks in advance. But even with the packed house, which was rabid early but died out in the middle of the show, it was clear in many ways that WCW was losing ground. There were numerous signs confiscated at the door, some of which had to be due to the language, some of which were because they were pro-WWF, although many pro-WWF signs snuck through security and were visible on television, but it even got to the point where a sign that read "Booker T sucks" was quickly grabbed. The crowd was the typical Bay Area crowd, where the idea of cheering cool heels dates back to the 60s with Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson and the original Oakland Raiders. It was one of the few markets in the country where Hulk Hogan was cheered more than Ric Flair. I have a feeling the booking of the past few weeks of television to make Flair the establishment traditionalist, which isn't going to get over anywhere except that Flair has so much charisma and respect from fans that they don't want to boo him, has more to do with turning Flair than any underlying popularity of Hogan. Whatever the reason, Flair seemingly didn't mind, since he wants to go heel, a position he feels more comfortable with in the ring. But the booking of the finish was clearly designed at trying to kill what's left of Flair's popularity off, since he always comes up short due to constantly being portrayed as outsmarted and with less organized backup, in an era where that is no longer a desirable babyface quality. Flair did carry Hulk Hogan to his best match in a few years. A few weeks ago, it looked as though this match was going to do a monster buy rate. Judging from the TV ratings the week before the show, that may not have been the case, but it exemplified WCW's biggest problems, the fact the public is seeing it as the seniors tour and that there is nothing being done to change the perception, and that nobody believes there is a possibility of clean finishes in big matches, as once again when Flair put the figure 4 on. Even before David Flair came out of the curtain, all heads turned to the back rather than gave any attention to the ring, where a world title match change was seemingly on the verge of taking place. In another era, the babyfaces, the Horsemen, Page and Piper, continually getting screwed up and down the show and looking to persevere might have been effective. But times have changed and everyone knows it. Instead of building up interest in future matches, the booking was done to kill people up and down the show: Benoit and Malenko, Mysterio Jr. and Khan and Piper, Flair and probably both Bill Goldberg and Bam Bam Bigelow. Since Diamond Dallas Page probably booked his own finish, he didn't book it to kill himself. But in not understanding the audience changes, he did himself no favors either. Fans will get behind someone who gets screwed bad and comes back for revenge, and does something about it. They won't get behind someone who gets screwed, comes back, only to be outwitted and screwed again. It's not a face-heel thing, it's that nobody has any patience in 1999 for people who are constantly, easily and regularly duped. Why waste emotional involvement on it when you've got Mick Foley and Steve Austin, who may get screwed from time to time, but they're going to get their chances to foil their rivals' plots and laugh as they explode in their face, as often as not. 1. Booker T. Lane Huffman pinned Disco Inferno, Glenn Gilberti, in 9:19. This match had a lot of heat as the crowd was wanting to see action. Basic solid opener with T doing his signature moves, which all got a big pop. T won with a Harlem Hangover, with the landing looking really scary as he caught his knee on the side of Disco's head. Fortunately, Disco wasn't injured. 1 3/4 stars. 2. Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, beat Perry Saturn, Perry Sotelo, in 11:17. This match was a mix of very good spots, fast pacing, weak transitions, and bad brawling. It had the single best spot of the show, where Saturn ripped Ralphus' dress off and he ran away in his underwear. The stip was that if Jericho lost, he'd have to wear the dress. It was never said that if Saturn lost, he'd get to take the dress off. The original stip was Saturn would have to wear the dress for 90 days, but in this match it was pointed out by the announcers that Saturn's 30 days were up and he was still wearing the dress. The idea of the match was to get across that Saturn had a chance to win, then walked out, because he still wants to wear the dress. How that makes sense of them even having this stipulation to begin with is beyond anyone's comprehension. Scott Dickinson returned as ref, and didn't do anything to play heel once the match started aside from coming out with Jericho and Ralphus. Saturn was also wearing even more eye makeup. You know, if Saturn just had big implants put in and wore a wig, he could go to the WWF and beat China. Both guys worked extremely hard. Jericho called Saturn Klinger after the character in the 70s TV series MASH who wore a dress. At least he didn't call him Uncle Mitty. Jericho missed a screw. There's probably another joke in there somewhere, except Shivani upon seeing it just pointed out how Jericho isn't any good with flying moves and should leave it to the luchadores. Saturn did his world's highest splash off the top spot. Some real good near falls but some sloppy transitions in between at the end. There was a great spot where Jericho did a crossbody off the top and Saturn turned it into the rings of Saturn, and Jericho got a great rope break out of it. After a few more near falls, Saturn finally hit the Death Valley driver on Jericho, then did the move on Dickinson. He then walked out. When Dickinson recovered, he counted Saturn out, as if the unprovoked DVD wasn't a DQ. Finish was beyond lame when Kevin Nash did it at Havoc, so why would it be even better in a prelim match now? 2.5 stars. 3. Billy Kidman, Pete Gruner, beat Chavo Guerrero Jr., Salvador Guerrero III, in 8:26. A very well-worked match, but it seriously lacked heat. Guerrero did a running flip dive over the top to the floor. He also used a Frankensteiner off the top for a good near fall. Kidman eventually won with a shooting star press. A disappointment. 2.5 stars. 4. Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko, Dean Simon, beat Barry Windham and Curt Hennig in 1934 to earn a second match for the tag team titles. In that one, Windham and Hennig won in 20 seconds. Benoit was the best worker on the show with all his realistic-looking offense. Mike Tenay said that Benoit was looking for his first title ever in WCW. I guess those TV title reigns don't count after all. Windham is one of those guys who serves no purpose in a promotion. Because he's so boring, he can't be pushed. Because he's so big, all he does is serve to make the big guys look like average guys, and when he's in there with guys the size of Benoit and Malenko, makes them look like midgets next to this guy who isn't even being pushed. Crowd liked Benoit and Hennig worked well bumping for him. Windham isn't terrible, but his sluggishness killed the match every time he tagged in. The people simply don't buy Malenko against guys of this size. Unfortunately, they've created this stigma about cruiserweights, so none of the guys who should be top cruiserweights like Malenko, Benoit, Guerrero and Jericho want to be in the division because it's a killer. But in Malenko's case, he can't get over outside the division because of his size. He couldn't in Japan either. The first match was good in spots but eventually was out there way too long and the crowd was dead. They didn't care about anyone but Benoit, and after that long, were losing interest in him. The finish of the first match was pretty good, with a lot of near falls and saves ending with Malenko making Windham submit to the Texas Cloverleaf. The bell never actually rang to begin the second match, which was to begin after a 30 seconds rest period. Windham took off his belt and choked Malenko out with it, and then lariated him and got the pin. I guess it was 20 seconds because it really never started. Boy did it make Benoit and Malenko look bad. 1 3/4 stars. 5. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall beat Rey Mysterio Jr., Oscar Gutierrez, and Conan Charles Ashenoff in 11 minutes. Hall replaced Lex Luger, who couldn't go because of the surgery to repair his torn left bicep, although he and Elizabeth were at ringside. Hall sold all of Mysterio Jr.'s flying moves until catching him with a fallaway slam. He was thrown around like a dart until he made the hot tag. That hot tag didn't last long, as you could imagine. Mysterio Jr. tagged in, while Luger tripped Conan and threw him into the steps to take him out of the picture. Mysterio Jr. hit a top rope quebrada on Nash and Nash was selling it like he was dead. Elizabeth distracted the ref, so Hall used the outsider's edge on Mysterio Jr. and put Nash on top for the pin. Mysterio Jr. unmasked after the match. Crowd didn't react to the unmasking like it was any big deal, although Schiavone did try to play it up as if was history in the making. Mysterio Jr. was a great one-man show here. 3 1/4 stars. 6. Scott Reach Steiner, beat Diamond Dallas Page Falkenberg, in 13:53 to retain the TV title. This was very similar to their match at the Cow Palace 2 nights earlier, and since probably close to half the crowd had seen it, that probably wasn't the smartest thing. Steiner was over as the total babyface, probably because everyone likes his music. It doesn't explain why Conan and Mysterio Jr. were cheered in the previous match where logic would think they'd be booed out of place against Hall and Nash here. Fast-paced and real good work. Buff Bagwell came out with Scott. Steiner cut his forehead. When Bagwell distracted Page, who hit him, Scott clotheslined him to take over. Steiner used some chairs to the back. Bagwell undid the padding on the turnbuckle. He went for the Steiner recliner but Page stopped him with a low blow. Charles Robinson saw Bagwell undoing the padding and booted him out. Page used a pescado but Steiner came back and whipped Page back first into the steps, continually working on the back. Page was on top and Steiner shook the ropes, crotching him. Steiner then did the Frankensteiner off the top for a near fall. Page did the Diamond Dream, although Steiner actually slipped out so the over didn't look good. Steiner first whipped Page's ribs into the exposed metal turnbuckle, then dropped his head on the steel, then picked him up and slammed his lower back into it 3 times before putting Page away clean with the Steiner recliner, although Page didn't tap out and instead they did the referee having to stop the match because Page was out finish. There was a huge face pop for Steiner winning. Page went out on a stretcher and fans were chanting DDP sucks at him. If they were paying attention, they'd realize he sure didn't in this match. 3 1/4 stars. 7. Scott Hall won the U.S. title from Roddy Piper, Roderick Toombs, in 8:19. Tenay said this was Piper's 3rd reign as U.S. champion, having first won the title from Ric Flair. Only because, as sick as this sounds, I was actually at the Cow Palace on June 24, 1978, which was actually Piper's first reign beating Moondog Mayne, although I guess that was another United States title. What can be said about Piper that hasn't been said? He was a zombie who could barely move out there. They traded eye pokes. Piper can't bump and looks so bad out there. To make things worse, He's this all-time legend and the match had no heat. This is the kind of stuff WCW needs to no longer present if they are in this game for the long haul. Piper got the sleeper on. Disco Inferno ran down and Piper punched him. Kevin Nash came down and Piper went to punch him, but we knew Nash wasn't about to sell anything for Piper. Hull grabbed a double leg and put his feet on the ropes for leverage and got the pin. Finish was even worse than the body of the match, and that wasn't easy. My guess is that Piper, who is from the old school star mentality where he hates to do jobs, would only do a job, which he pretty much had to do, in this manner, being also that he's not exactly fond of Nash and Hull. The post-match where Piper grabbed the belt, and then it appeared nobody could figure out how to get out of it, was beyond bad. -1.25 star. 8. Bill Goldberg pinned Bam Bam Bigelow, Scott Bigelow, in 11:39. As of 1 week ago, this was booked to be a quickie. Bigelow came out to no ring music, so he appeared to be even deader than he is. This was the deadest Goldberg match since his infamous TV match with Steven Regal. It went too long, and while Goldberg sold his leg well, the match made him just another wrestler and he can't get over as anything special in the role. The awkwardness in talking about the Tonight Show appearance by the announcers didn't help. All in all, this was a major step backwards for him, even though he was protected and won clean. There was a cool spot where Goldberg went for the spear and Bigelow jumped out of the ring to avoid it. When he got back in, he got speared twice and pinned after a jackhammer. Goldberg nearly lost him on the finish. 1/2 star. 9. Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, retained the WCW title, pinning Ric Flair, Richard Fliehr, in 12 minutes. How many times will Bobby Heenan bring up that Flair is the last man he ever managed? At times this match was really entertaining. Flair worked a semi-heel style since he's better at carrying people with it. For whatever reason, Hogan was better than usual, although it was like watching a greatest hits of the 80s video. Flair did his signature stuff and they traded the hard chops. Hogan hit a chair to the head and a terrible second chair shot, and like the old Flair of the old era, Flair came up with a gusher. I guess juice is back on both sides. So much for holding the high moral ground. Hogan suplexed Flair on the floor and slammed him off the top. Hogan started whipping Flair hard with his weightlifting belt. Tons of belt shots. Hogan started no-selling the chops on Flair's orders. Flair came back with a series of low blows on his comeback, then got the belt, and gave Hogan some of the worst belt shots in history. After punching Hogan with the buckle, Hogan juiced. Tori Wilson came to ringside, to borrow a Flair phrase, looking as only she can look. She slapped Flair. The minute she showed up in that dress guaranteed that half the women in this business will be going to their surgeons for more work, because the bar has been raised to a ridiculous level. She could be a marketing bonanza for WCW, because she's fresher and more attractive than any of the women in WWF, although some could debate that. But for angle purposes, has more presence and can talk and deliver a line better than any woman in wrestling already. Since it's WCW where every ball put right in their glove is still dropped, she probably won't be. Flair came back with a back suplex and vertical suplex, but ref Charles Robinson got bumped. Hogan elbow dropped him. Hogan did his foot to the face that was supposed to hit, and he came closer than usual, but it still looked bad. He badly needs to retire that move. He missed the leg drop and Flair put on the figure 4. David Flair came out in a leather jacket wearing an NWO red t-shirt with a taser and a ski mask over his head and zapped Flair twice and Hogan pinned him. After the match he unmasked and started swapping spit with Tori. 2 3/4 stars. In yet another example of one of life and wrestling's most perplexing moments, WCW told Bill Goldberg to go on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno on February 19th and issue a challenge to Steve Austin, and then failed to follow up on their own idea for this major grandstand angle with their typically Weasley acknowledgement of it on the pay-per-view and Nitro that didn't even mention Austin's name. Twice on Nitro, Tony Schiavone made reference to the challenge heard round the world issued by Goldberg on The Leno Show, which was pushed hard all through Thunder the night before the challenge as the main topic of the show. Since the challenge itself drew almost no mainstream publicity, partially due to it coming off week on the show for a number of reasons, viewers of WCW events who didn't watch Leno would have had no idea what Schiavone was talking about and probably figured he must have meant Scott Steiner, who they built as Goldberg's foe on the February 22nd Nitro main event. He mentioned the challenge had gone unanswered and made some remarks about how some people can talk the talk but won't walk the walk, but without making clear what he was talking about. His statements largely were that cryptic WCW language that nobody but insiders understand and only annoy most viewers with the announcing crew. Goldberg himself didn't want to issue the challenge to Austin. feeling it might make him seem like a star beneath the level of Austin publicly, which, although he isn't something that WCW should put Goldberg in the position of looking like, since he's still the most marketable wrestler in the company. It was the idea of Eric Bischoff and Kevin Nash who ordered him to do it, and as usual, wasn't very well thought out, since the original idea was for Goldberg to challenge anyone in the rival company. Thinking through possible scenarios for that could be disastrous to WCW from a PR standpoint. Instead, the decision was made to challenge Austin specifically. Goldberg was told to say he was putting up $100,000 of his own money for a winner-take-all match for charity, and if he won, his winnings would go to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or another animal rights type of organization that Goldberg legitimately devotes a lot of time to. Nash had also told Goldberg he was working on this backdoor building to some sort of a deal he was hoping to put together where he and Goldberg would do a work-shoot angle with Austin and Ken Shamrock, feeling the interpromotional aspect of it would get the world thinking it was real and it would become the biggest thing in wrestling in years, particularly with Shamrock's name involved, and eventually turn it into a worked fight when it took place, and he'd share in the spotlight of the big interpromotional angle, which would give him the rub from the match and the stars involved, along with a rep as a shooter to the fans, which comes in handy every now and then if there is a serious angle being done. How he would go about pulling this off, since his idea was to get Austin and Shamrock to agree to it without working through McMahon, unless that aspect of the idea was a work to hide something as well, is anyone's guess. The idea was to do it on NBC, which is why Goldberg brought up on the Leno show the idea of having the match on NBC and held near the Tonight Show set. While Goldberg did well on the show with the usual references to his ring name and Jewish heritage, there were numerous problems with the challenge itself. First, he only had a few minutes. Second, he didn't deliver the challenge with much conviction nor cited any good reasons, the latter of which may have been due to time restraints. Leno actually brought Austin's name up first, and in his tone, was acting as if it was typical pro wrestling, and the combination of Austin's name getting almost no audience response and Leno's delivery pretty well doomed whatever this was attempting to accomplish. Goldberg issuing the challenge with no reason being given, as there was a way he could have done it to make it appear he's responding to things the rival company has previously said and done to mock him, rather than the way it did, would come off to some that he was trying to hook himself to Austin's star. There was no explanation as to what the ramifications were, such as him even being in another organization, made it just seem like a typical pro wrestling challenge. It was clear the studio audience for Leno didn't understand this was anything different than usual. Austin's name, which from the reaction is still not a household name even though he's a huge star within certain demographic groups, generally age groups younger than the audience watching Leno or in his studio. The reaction to the challenge was laughter at hearing someone do a pro wrestling challenge as opposed to the kind of reaction of people hearing something that shocked and interested them. He never even got the raising money for charity aspect of the angle across, probably due to having to rush everything because he was brought out with so little time left in the show. When it was over, it was clear it came across as too weak and did nothing for anyone involved. Nevertheless, when Austin was on Howard Stern on February 22nd, the subject was brought up with Austin trying to blow it off by saying that Goldberg was wrestling in the minor leagues and he'd be glad to wrestle him if he came to the WWF, but blew it off for now. He also tried to dismiss Goldberg as simply a copy of himself because of their similar blank trunks and shaved head looks. That response was risky as well, as any casual fan would hear that statement, being Goldberg is one of the 3 biggest stars in the business today, would see it as backing down, which is not exactly what his character's popularity was built on. Luckily, there was so little interest in all of this, as apparently most fans could see it for what it was, that it really didn't matter what Austin said in response. On Raw, the WWF, smartly, never acknowledged the issue. We were told it probably wouldn't be acknowledged on TV and there were no plans to do so unless someone came up with a clever idea as a response. Unlike WWF, which plays clips of its stars' mainstream media interviews, WCW played no clips of this poor attempt at an attention-getting angle on Nitro. Guaranteed if Hogan was involved we'd see 15 clips per show, and its acknowledgments were so weak by not mentioning Austin or WWF, probably due to being afraid of a legal threat, they may as well have not said anything, which if you can't tell the story and sell the angle, would have been the smart way to handle it, which of course meant the opposite would take place in WCW. Last year, when Bischoff issued the challenge to Vince McMahon, which got laughable and pathetic by the end, WWF sends several legal threats to WCW claiming WCW was trying to mislead its viewers into the idea a match with a non-WCW contracted employee could take place when it wasn't going to. This even turned funny because when Bischoff actually went on the air and did an interview and said that match wouldn't take place, WWF complained about that as well, saying basically that wrestling fans are so conditioned to always being lied to, that when Bischoff said it wouldn't take place, he was leading the fans to believe that it would, and thus using McMahon's name to sell pay-per-view orders. There is little question that the last few years represent major change in the wrestling industry in Japan, as well as anywhere else. The transitions can almost be best represented by the departure of the legends who made the business in the 70s and 80s, the retirements of Antonio Inoki and Riki Choshu in 1997, and to a lesser extent Masa Saito, who for all real purposes finished up in 1996 but made it official last week, and perhaps most important, the death of Giant Baba. Probably stemming on the heels of the latter, and another representation of the former, was that on February 20th, Tomomi Jumbo Tsuruta officially announced his retirement from pro wrestling in a press conference held before the start of All Japan's first tour since the death of Baba. Tsuruta won't be coming back for a retirement match but will be at the March 6th Budokan Hall show before leaving on March 10th for the United States. He'll return for one final appearance to say goodbye and have a ceremony at the April 16th All Japan Budokan Hall Champion Carnival final show, as he'll be returning to Japan for that weekend, also for the public Giant Baba funeral the next afternoon. Tsuruta, probably the third biggest native star in Japan of the 70s behind Baba and Inoki, had not been a serious performer since being struck down at a career peak in 1992 by hepatitis B. Over the past 7 years, Tsuruta had appeared on occasional major shows in the comedy six-man tags, tagging in briefly to just do his trademark spots like his back suplex, his high knee, which wasn't so high of late, and raising his arms to the crowd and going, "Oh," which the crowd responding in a Ric Flair response-like imitation. Tsuruta, 47, who has been working as a professor teaching training for athletics and exercise physiology at 3 different Tokyo universities. He will be moving to Portland, Oregon on March 10th for a 2-year stay to study and teach at Portland State University in the field of exercise physiology. Tsuruta was one of the very rare natural performers, a wrestler who was literally a great worker from the very first day he stepped foot in a pro ring, and there was no question even from day one he'd be one of wrestling's biggest superstars. In some ways similar to current All Japan wrestler Jun Akiyama, who was already a good worker and a surefire bet to be a great worker in his very first pro match. He was both a basketball and wrestling star at Chuo College. In both 1971 and 1972 he captured the Japanese national championship in both freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling. He went to the Munich Olympics in 1972 in Greco-Roman, placing 7th in a super heavyweight division that included future pro wrestlers Wilfred Dietrich and Chris Taylor. He was the first major newcomer signed by Baba when All Japan was created, and was sent to Amarillo to train under Dory Funk Jr. He debuted in Texas amidst a lot of mainstream fanfare in Japan, wrestled in the States for a few months before debuting in a main event position as one of Baba's 2 regular tag team partners, the other being the Destroyer, for much of the 70s. Since Tsuruta, who was 6'4" and 270 pounds most of his career, and the nickname Jumbo referred to him being so much larger than most Japanese heavyweights at the time, it's almost funny that one of his first famous early matches was a challenge to Ken Mantell for the NWA World Junior Heavyweight title in Japan, and had classic undercard matches in Florida as a junior heavyweight facing former champion Danny Hodge in his first year or 2 as a pro. In Japan's all-time wrestling hierarchy, the big 3 of course were Rikitos and Baba, and Inoki. Tsuruta would be ranked in the second group, with Riki Choshu and Tatsumi Fujinami, and possibly in some ways due to each's cult popularity in the late 80s or early 90s, Akira Maeda and Atsushi Onita. When Baba stepped down from main events in 1985, Tsuruta and Genichiro Tenryu feuded over the top spot with classic matches. When Tenryu left, it was Tsuruta doing the job for Mitsuharu Misawa that ushered in the era of Misawa, Toshiaki Kawada, who Tsuruta never did a job for even though they met in each dozens of times in important tag team matches, Kena Kobashi and Akira Taue. While always on top, and virtually always holding or challenging for a major All Japan singles or tag team title, his career told its own particular story. In the 70s, he was the hot rising star, Baba's understudy in the same role that Inoki later created for Fujinami. Fujinami and Tsuruta had many similarities, although Tsuruta was a big heavyweight and Fujinami was really a bulked-up junior heavyweight. Both were excellent workers, far outshining the men they backed up. Both never fully escaped the large shadows created by the years of being number 2 in the company. In 1979, during an interpromotional show, the two actually teamed together with Mil Mascaras in a trios match. In 1990 were attempts to put together an interpromotional feud between the two, but it never happened. As for Tsuruta's career, in the 70s he was pretty much in the Inoki role of the 60s, as the great athlete and technical wrestler who had the classic world title matches against the likes of Terry Funk and Harley Race. By the early 80s, He was a veteran, having classic title matches with Ric Flair and feuding on top with Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen. He wrestled his own style, and in 1985, when Riki Choshu and his group joined All Japan and the style changed, Chumbo was kind of left in the shadows, not really adapting to the faster-paced big move-oriented matches, which actually made Tenryu the hotter wrestler. But when Choshu left, Tsuruta stepped up to the plate and battled Tenryu for the top spot in what were the best matches in pro wrestling at the time, and when Tenryu left, continued that level of performance with Misawa, Kawada, and Kobashi. As the top star with All Japan, at the time the hottest promotion in the world, and him being one of the best workers in the business, he was named 1991 Wrestling Observer Wrestler of the Year. At the age of 40, after the best year of his career, he was stricken with hepatitis B in the spring 1992, and his career as a full-time main event performer was over just like that. Even in the 80s, Tsuruta was portrayed by those who knew him well and worked with him as someone who had a natural affinity for pro wrestling, but didn't necessarily like it. Due to owning points in the All Japan company, he was already a millionaire and wrestled more out of loyalty to Baba than any passion for wrestling. Clearly by the late 80s something must have changed, because nobody without a passion for wrestling becomes one of the top 5 workers in the business, particularly as they close in on 40. Perhaps the enthusiasm in those days of the younger wrestlers climbing the ladder that he would oppose, mainly Misawa, Kawada and Kobashi, since Tsuruta was the regular tag team partner of Taue, combined with that of the fans since All Japan was playing to mainly sellouts, particularly in Tokyo, in those days, was infectious. The timing of his moving to the US as it relates to the death of Baba seems to indicate that he most likely was remaining as a teacher in Japan and an officer of the company out of loyalty to Baba, who made him who he was. When the NTV announcement of the death of Baba was made, it was Misawa, Tsuruta and Mitsuo Momota, as the son of Rikidozen, who made the public announcement, and it was thought they would be the ones running the company in the transition period before Misawa took complete control, although Tsuruta was certainly figured not to be a strong part of the equation except to the honorary degree of being the lone senior legend left with the company. Tsuruta leaving this early indicates something, probably with Baba no longer around. He felt the moral ties of paying back the company that made him to be no longer there and was free to pursue his own personal goals in life. An investigation of the WWF and pro wrestling in general by the tabloid television show Inside Edition, which at press time was scheduled to air on February 23 and February 24, received a lot of mainstream publicity early this week. An AP story carried in newspapers around the country on February 21 and February 22 noted a one-year analysis of 50 Raw episodes from January 12, 1998 through February 1, 1999 by the program and by Indiana University, revealed an average of 36 minutes of wrestling on a weekly 2-hour show and noted 1,658 incidents of wrestlers grabbing or pointing to their crotch, 434 references to the word suck it, 157 examples of giving the dreaded finger, 128 acts of simulated sexual activity either alone or with others, 47 simulated acts or references to satanic activity, 42 examples of simulated drug use and possession, 21 acts of either urination, appearing to do so or talking about doing so, and 20 appearances of characters as prostitutes. The 2-part series is scheduled to focus on the content of the Raw program on February 24, which will include an interview with Vince McMahon done at Titan Towers, and on the outside the ring behavior of pro wrestlers on February 25. Largely based on the deaths of Brian Pillman, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, and Louis Piccoli. ESPN's Outside the Lines investigative sports series is scheduled to do a 1-hour look at the pro wrestling world in the near future. The February 24 episode is also scheduled to talk about the situation in Winnipeg, which has continued over the past week to be a major local news story. The February 21 Winnipeg Free Press ran a front-page story. The lead with wrestling impresario Vince McMahon has an answer for Winnipeg educators concerned about young students mimicking TV wrestlers. He doesn't care. The story noted McMahon will say on the February 24 episode in reference to the stories in Winnipeg, "Give me a break. A teachers' association? Give me a break. Winnipeg? Don't hold that up as wow. Look what's going on. Hey folks, they're banned in Winnipeg. Thank you." McMahon's comments apparently killed whatever chance there were that efforts by WWF Canada President Carl DeMarco to turn this negative into a PR positive would go through, although it appeared sentiment had turned greatly against that taking place. DeMarco wanted to bring wrestlers to Winnipeg schools, saying they would dress normally and use their real names as opposed to their stage names, and urged children to avoid drugs and stay in school. DeMarco was quoted in regard to young children mimicking language and gestures they learned from WWF programming tried to side with the teachers. You're hearing the WWF saying those kids are wrong, and they need to be punished. I'm agreeing with the teachers. Lori Johnson, the Winnipeg board chairwoman who has been most vocal about wanting Raw moved to a later time slot on TSN, one of the major issues is besides the Raw initial airing on TSN at 8 to 10 p.m. on Monday nights, there is a replay showing from 3 to 5 p.m. on a weekday afternoon, where it has become the network's highest-rated regular weekly show. Said in the story, "I will do everything I can to convince trustees that their interests and ours are incompatible." Earlier in the week, in a page 3 story in the Winnipeg Sun, board trustee Mario Santos that colleagues who had already decided against allowing wrestlers to speak to students before seeing a written proposal from the WWF were wrong. "Some of my colleagues have prejudged it because it's wrestling. They should not have their personal feelings on the issue affect how they vote. They have an obligation to wait and listen to the evidence. How can I reject a proposal I haven't seen yet?" Santos did say he would never vote in favor of allowing wrestlers to visit schools if the wrestlers were in town already for a show. "I would see that as nothing more than advertising," he said. "If they really mean what I'm told they want to do, they will make a special trip to do it." DeMarco's original plan was to send wrestlers to talk with Winnipeg students in conjunction with the Mayhouse show at the Winnipeg Arena. There was a sidebar to the story with an interview with Tony Pavia, the principal of a high school in Stamford, Connecticut, which allowed 4 WWF wrestlers to speak to students in December. "I absolutely understand the ethical and moral dilemma they have," Pavia said to The Sun. "I am acutely aware of how difficult a decision this would be for a school board, particularly in an elementary school and particularly where parents are upset." Pavia said he was worried, but said he okayed the WWF's initial no-bull session since students received signed permission slips from parents, and he was assured by the WWF what the wrestlers would be saying, and that it was done within the context of a course on sports literature. "Whether we like it or not, kids need to hear the messages we give them from somebody else. Would you throw out the message because you have an objection to the messenger? Who better to deliver that message than the people who are involved in it?" Mexico. The Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Psicosis mask match is a definite for February 25th at Auditorio Municipal in Tijuana. The local newspapers are predicting that it will be the largest indoor wrestling gate in the history of that storied building. Because of so much emphasis on the main event, and it will really be interesting how the press handles it this week since Mysterio Jr. already lost his mask in Oakland as was reported beforehand in a few media sources in Mexico. The only major match underneath is Conan and La Parka and Super Parka vs. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Silver King and Damien. AAA announced the 1999 Rey de Reyes, King of Kings, show for March 7th at El Toreo in Naucalpan will be headlined by a hair vs. mask match with Heavy Metal vs. Kickboxer. There will also be a 16-man tournament for the annual King of Kings with Octagon, El Alebrije, El Hijo del Solitario, Spectro Jr., Mascara Sagrada Jr., Dos Caras Cibernetico, Bismo Negro, Latin Lover, Oscar Sevilla, Panther, Apache Connect, Electroshock, Blue Demon Jr., and Pentagon. Pero Abuelo is saying that he hasn't left AAA, but will be doing a farewell tour and that he and his son would wrestle at Arena Mexico. He said the March 7th show will be the beginning of his retirement tour. It has not been said, but most speculation indicates his final match would take place at Arena Mexico at the anniversary show in September. Xochitl Hamada won the Reina de Reinas, Queen of Queens, tournament on February 19th in Puebla, beating Esther Moreno in the finals. On that show, Pero Abuelo Jr. teased a heel turn on Mascara Sagrada Jr., causing them to lose. There was a story that made some mainstream news regarding Brazo de Plata, Jesus Alvarado. On February 16th, a woman and her 13-year-old son went on a television show in Mexico City saying that Alvarado had attacked her son. Alvarado was interviewed in the February 18th editions of both Ovaciones and La Afición, saying that on February 10th, he was picking up his own 13-year-old son Giovanni from school and were accosted by several youths. They were making fun of his son and of him and of his profession, and it turned into a heated argument. Giovanni and another 13-year-old started exchanging punches. Alvarado claimed that a taxi cab driver, out of nowhere, jumped in and started punching his son and that he grabbed his son, went into his car and drove off. The match for the vacant CMLL tag titles takes place on February 26th at Arena Mexico with El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas vs. Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. Panther beat Hater in a mask vs. mask match to headline AAA's February 14th show in Monterrey. Also on the show, Sangre Chicana retained the Mexican national light heavyweight title, beating Latin Lover, and Los Vados Locos, Charlie Manson, Enigma, and May Flowers and Picudo, beat Los Vipers, AAA Hysteria and AAA Psicosis and AAA Mosco de la Merced and Maniaco, to win the Mexican national 4-man titles. Olympico retained the CMLL welterweight title, pinning Fuerza Guerrera after blocking a low blow, which Guerrera had used to pin him on several occasions, on February 16 at Arena Coliseo. AAA ran Tijuana on February 19 with Aguayo and Octagon and Dos Caras vs Cibernetico and Jerry Estrada and Pentagon and Los Vipers vs Los Vados Locos on top. The father of women wrestlers Esther Rossi, Cinchia and Alda Moreno passed away on February 14. We don't have his real name, but he was a pro wrestler who used the name El Acorazado, and was a low-card wrestler who was best known for so many of his children getting into wrestling. Black Warrior beat Atlantis on February 14 in Netzahualcoyot to keep the NWA Light Heavyweight title. The first Arena Mexico show of the year on February 19 was pretty well uneventful. Only one match, a mid-card match with Blue Panther and Black Warrior and El Satanico beating Ringo Mendoza and Shocker and Felino, was even described in the press as being good. The Headhunters returned, through the dealings of Victor Quiñones and with the WWF deal finalized, teaming with Tinieblas Jr. losing to Cien Caras and Mascara Año 2000 and Apollo Dantes when Cien used a low blow on Tinieblas. Main event saw Dr. Wagner Jr. and Scorpio Jr. and Bestia Salvaje over Negro Casas and Atlantis and Mr. Niebla. Zorro is expected to start with CMLL when he returns from Japan. Pero Aguayo and Pero Aguayo Jr. defended the Mexican national tag titles against Cobarde and Cobarde Jr. on February 22 in Nuevo Laredo. IWRG held the 9th annual High Power Cup, which is a tradition in Naucalpan. It's a 10-man elimination match where Mexico faces wrestlers from another country. In this case, Japan. Mascara Sagrada ended up winning it as the final survivor. The Japan team consisted of Sagrada, Kato Kung Lee Sr., who is actually from Panama, Mega, Alcon Dorado Jr., and Super Parka. The Japanese team was Shima Nobunaga, Sumo Fuji, Judo Suwa, Yoshikazu Taro, and Sasuke the Great. They are now saying that Rayo de Jalisco Jr. may be out of action for the rest of the year. All Japan. Although the crowd enthusiasm was said to have been super at the February 13 Korakuen Hall show, the first card since Baba's death, this first tour back has not drawn after the traditional opening night, February 20th, sellout at Korakuen Hall. The first night saw a unique match where rookie Masamichi Marufuji, who is like a young Mitsuharu Misawa, teamed with Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa over Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama and Yoshinobu Kanemaru in 21:46 when Ogawa pinned Kanemaru. The main event had Vader and Stan Hansen and Manukia Mossman over Akira Taue and Tamon Honda and Jun Izumida when Vader pinned Izumida. The tour is of course weekend without Toshiaki Kawada. However, the February 21st show in Kobe, headlined by the first ever meeting of Vader and Hansen versus Misawa and Taue, only drew 2,100. The finish saw Vader pin Misawa with the Big Van Crush, Vader Bomb, in 9:58. The third night of the tour on February 22nd in Imabari drew just 1,050 for the typical six-man with Vader's regular team, Hansen and Mossman, over Misawa's regular team Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara. It's considered by most a lock that Vader will get the title on March 6th. It is not a lock that he will defend against Misawa at the Tokyo Dome. Apparently, with it being so public that Misawa is both company president and booker, he feels it's not the right thing for him to also be the top star in the ring, and wants to push Kobashi as the top star with him moving down the card. We shall see, since Vader already has 2 pins on Misawa in tag matches this year, which seemingly builds to that match as the big one. There have been media reports predicting that Baba's public funeral on April 17th will be one of the largest funerals in history. One newspaper actually predicted 40,000 people would show up for it. Misawa and Mitsuo Momota are currently running the office. New Japan. Really very little of note. There was a press conference announcing the breakup of the Heisei Ishgun organization. The group, formed in 1994, had been lost in the shuffle with the NWO group and now groups being the dominant foreign rivals to New Japan. Shiro Koshinaka will probably start teaming with New Japan wrestlers again, with the current idea for him to form a tag team with Kensuke Sasaki. Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara are expected to be a lower card tag team doing their Freedom Dogs gimmick. Kengo Kimura rarely wrestles anymore as he mainly is helping out his wife, who is a senator in Japan. Funyaki Kobayashi has a bad back and only wrestles sparingly nowadays. It was announced that Alexander Otsuka, Minoru Tanaka and Yuki Ishikawa of Battlers will appear on the April 10th Tokyo Dome show. Don Frye issued a challenge to Keiji Muto for the IWGP title for that show, but it is believed Muto vs Masahiro Chono will wind up as the main event. Chono is expected to make most of the cities on the next tour, but not all of them. Only a few matches have been announced for the next tour: a Jushin Liger vs Koji Kanemoto IWGP Junior title match on March 17 in Hiroshima, a Dr. Wagner Jr. and Kendo Kashin vs El Samurai and Gran Hamada IWGP Junior tag title match on March 20 in Nagoya, and a Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan tag title defense, no opponents named, for March 22 in Amagasaki. Seiji Sakaguchi held a press conference this past week in Sapporo announcing a May 31, 2001 date at the Sapporo Dome, which will hold 52,300 fans for pro wrestling. The new arena, which was built for $350 million, will open for baseball on April 20, 2001. The old Nakajima Sports Center in Sapporo, which has housed wrestling dating back to the 60s, will be torn down later in the year, so New Japan will probably cut down to only running Sapporo with one major dome show per year and maybe a secondary show. There is another 10,000-seat building in Sapporo that New Japan has run once, rather than several major house shows throughout the year. It's expected that Shinya Hashimoto will return for April 10th at the Dome. If that show isn't headlined by Hashimoto vs Naoya Ogawa in a rematch, that should confirm what was or wasn't an angle on the January 4th show. Most of the reports we receive from the inside indicate that New Japan and UFO have totally split, with UFO opening separate offices in both Tokyo and Los Angeles. But with Antonio Inoki involved, you never know what to believe, because he'll go to great lengths to make his angles appear legit. Muto vs Sasaki on the February 14th Budokan was described as a classic, nearly 30-minute old-style match, all psychology with no fancy moves or big spots. Muto didn't even do a moonsault because he wanted to show old style. Because of his injuries, Muto needs to tone down and feels this may be his last reign on top, and is looking at a long reign going through the young guys, Manabu Nakanishi, Yuji Nagata, Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima, in title matches before meeting one of the guys who can win the title. I guess that means if he faces Chono, it'll be non-title. Chono has been described as not the same in the ring, but he's able to get by. The actual situation why Akira Nagami had been gone is that even though he was legitimately injured, that wasn't the main reason. His wife, Reiko Saiki, is a fairly famous, not top Meryl Streep level, but a level underneath, like a Rosanna Arquette actress, and Nagami has appeared in plays and movies with her. He wanted to work part-time as a wrestler as opposed to full-time, and Choshu wouldn't go for it, and it appeared the two sides would simply let his contract expire. He was brought back as a favor to Chono and got a new contract for 1999 because Chono needed someone who could work to carry him in tag matches with Tenzan on the other side. February 6th TV did a 3.4 rating and February 13th did a 3.8. Other Japan notes. Antonio Inoki made a deal with Howard Brody, using Hiro Matsuda as an intermediary, to set up an NWA title change, with Dan Severn losing to Naoya Ogawa on March 14th at the Yokohama Arena. They're trying to make a big deal that Severn will be bringing the same title belt. Actually, it's a duplicate-looking belt that people like Harley Race, Terry Funk, Jack Briscoe and Giant Baba wore in Japan in the 70s, and since Inoki himself spent years trying to gain access to the NWA title when it meant something, and with people like Inoki, time often stands still. Ogawa also challenged Nobuhiko Takada to a match for the NWA title after he beat Severn. Severn is receiving $35,000 per show for a 3-show deal, which includes the promise that he'll get the title back, which tentatively is scheduled for a show in the United States in late April. There are a lot of political flies in the ointment. Apparently Severn himself had signed a 4-tour deal with Doug Gilbert and the IWA, which has 3 tours remaining. Apparently through IWA, Inichiro Tenryu had expressed interest in doing a win-and-lose scenario for the belt as well. The NWA board had originally approved of Severn losing the title to Doug Gilbert on March 13th in Toms River, New Jersey, but pulled him from the date when the more lucrative UFO deal came through, since Gilbert would be available to work for more member promoters unlike Severn, who formerly had WWF commitments, which will be done next week, but also to seminars and may still be doing shoot fights. Brody made the deal with Inoki, then went to the board, although he got the necessary 4 votes, himself, Ernie Todd, Victor Quinones and Bill Behrens, to approve the switch. Inoki has officially joined the NWA, giving it its most powerful member, and it will be replacing Tony Rumble, who quit the board after Brody decided to take the NWA tag titles from his NWA New England promotion and give them to Ken Taylor, who promotes near Dallas, on the board, making him one of the 7 members who vote on title switches. Unlike UFO matches that end via knockout or submission, it appears they are going to do 3-count finishes in this match, since it's for a traditional belt and thus go with traditional pro wrestling rules. Oleg Toktarov will likely face Kazunari Murakami on the show as well. Coming off the big show on February 21st, Rings announced several major arena shows over the next several months. On March 22nd at Tokyo Bay NK Hall, besides the Randy Couture vs. Ilyukhin Mikhail match, will also be Kiyoshi Tamura vs. Hiromitsu Kanehara, Yoshihisa Yamamoto vs. Valentin Overeem, and Masayuki Naruse vs. Dave Von Popeye. The April 23rd Frank Shamrock vs. Tamura will be at Osaka Fujitsu Gym. May 22nd will be at Tokyo Ariake Coliseum, June 19th at Nagoya Aichi Gym, and back on July 23rd at Osaka Fujitsu Gym. They were looking at putting Tom Erickson vs. Ricardo Moraes on the May 22nd show. However, Moraes, who had signed a 2-fight deal, when he heard that Erickson was his proposed second opponent, refused to fight for the agreed-upon money, and it appears he's done with Rings. However, it appears Erickson will still debut on that show. Mariko Yoshida retained the Queen of Version belt over Hiromi Yagi on February 18th at Korakuen Hall. Hiromichi Fuyuki kept the FMW double title over Daisuke Ikeda on February 18th in Hiroshima. Pancrase on March 9th at Korakuen Hall has Daisuke Ishii vs. Daisuke Watanabe, Ikuiza Minowa vs. Kusei Kubota, Katsumi Inagaki vs. Satoshi Hasegawa, Keiichiro Yamamiya vs. Shunsuke Matsui, Takata Dojo, in a Valley Tudo rules match, Semishilt vs. Takafumi Ito. What a size disaster that is, as Ito couldn't be more than 5'7" and 170 pounds, and Schult is about 6'11". Yuki Kondo vs. Kyuma Kunyoku, and Manabu Yamada vs. Ryushi Yanagisawa. The April 18th pay-per-view main event has been changed to Kondo challenging Schult for the vacant King of Pancrase title. Shadow WX faces Abdullah the Butcher for the Big Japan King of the Death Matches title on February 28th at Korakuen Hall. Olympico Oriental, Virus, Rincor Latino, Rafael Salcero, Babe Richard, and Alcon Negro Jr. come in this week for the Cacao Tour for Super Delphin. Here and there. The Crusher, 72, recently had a second artificial hip put in. Jesse Ventura has been all over the media this past week, including David Letterman and Tom Snyder. Two pro wrestling references were a major knock on Hogan and WCW, as he hasn't forgotten when he went to Nitro at the Target Center when he was campaigning for office, and he's mad because WCW didn't put him on the air, and even more, that WCW kicked his camera crew out of the building. He said that's why when WCW came on February 1st, he didn't attend the show. He also said Hogan was jealous of him because even though Hogan has the biggest name in wrestling, he was the one who has the most credibility of anyone in wrestling. On C-SPAN, he was with New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman, who showed Ventura her honorary WWF title belt that The Undertaker gave her at the 1997 SummerSlam when she signed the bill to deregulate pro wrestling after an 8-year fight in New Jersey. Ventura gave her this "what a mark" kind of look, clearly wanting to be taken as something more than a one-time employee of the WWF at this stage of his life. The current Rolling Stone has an article about his inauguration, and Harper's recently ran a really interesting story about his election campaign. There was an indie show on February 12th in Canton, Ohio, which resulted in a major disturbance. Sid Vicious was supposed to appear but no-showed, claiming he had been in a bad car accident the night before. "Boy, I'd love to be his auto repair man. Wink, wink." When that announcement was made in the building, there was a near riot resulting in several arrests and a local TV and newspaper coverage. The fans were already unhappy because a match was announced as Disciple versus a member of the NWO, and it turned out to be Vince. The February 20th Power Pro TV show in Memphis saw Brian Christopher talk about an upcoming tournament for the first Power Pro tag team titles, saying he and Scott Taylor would win it. In the Lawler/Stacey soap opera, Lawler said that Stacey overreacted to his kissing Terry, supposedly Sean Stasiak's sister, but everything will be fine. Terry taped an interview calling Stacey a skank, and that Sean should dump her. She told Lawler to look her up the next time he came north and they'd share more than a kiss. Stacey showed up in the studio and put up a poster, with her butt exposed, that read "Need a valet? Contact Stacey." They showed a tape of February 13th from Jonesboro, Arkansas, where Michael Hayes and Brandon Baxter beat Randy Hales and Boy Tony and Jim Cornette. They showed a Hayes interview on tape thanking the fans in Memphis and Jonesboro for the crowds, and talked about Lawler, Dundee, Jimmy Valiant and Jackie Fargo being stars in the area, but that nobody could pack a building like the Freebirds. He talked about the history of the Freebirds and told Baxter that he'd be back and asked him to carry on the Freebird tradition. This is to set up Baxter using Bad Street USA as his entrance music. Speaking of Hayes, I saw the past few weeks TV. The Michael Hayes of 1984 would have been a superstar in the industry today. The Michael Hayes of 1999 is like a parody of a wrestler. It's this middle-aged beer-bellied second baseman still wearing a tank top on a softball team who probably was a stud in his youth if you get the picture. It was made worse when they showed a Hayes interview today and the Bad Street video from 1984. And it's like seeing this father of a rocker trying to play a rocker. It's good for Memphis because he can deliver an interview better than the guys there because he's so fluid, but it would be really bad on a national stage. It was really scary realizing that Hayes is actually 11 years younger than Ric Flair. Anyway, Hales tried to get Stacey to be his valet but she blew him off. Baldo destroyed Baxter, who was foaming at the mouth, until Dave Brown told him he'd be arrested if he didn't stop. Stacey did an interview and said Terry was a slut and her kiss with Lawler lasted too young and said that sex sells today in wrestling, hiked up her skirt, and showed Brown her poster and said Lawler and Stasiak need not apply. The show ended with Lawler versus Stasiak, with Stacey first helping Lawler, then Stasiak, and finally hitting Lawler with a loaded purse so Stasiak won and the two left together. After the match they were together in the parking lot when Lawler attacked Stasiak and tried to talk to Stacey but she drove off. Brian Christopher and Spellbinder, who wrestles as Streak in Memphis, captured the NWA Worldwide North American Tag titles from Reno Riggins and Stephen Dunn before 415 fans on February 20th in Nashville when Flash Flanagan hit Riggins with a chair. Stan Lane and Steve Kieran appear on March 13th against the winners of a match on March 5th with Dunn and Riggins versus Flanagan and a mystery partner. IWA is kicked out of Kentucky by the Athletic Commission and is now running across the border in Indiana. They are having a King of the Death Matches tournament on April 9th and April 10th which will include a barbed wire piranha death match. The original Leatherface, Rick Patterson, from Japan is being brought in and they are talking about trying to get Mitsuharu Matsunaga as well. The new PWI Almanac came out this week. As the years go by, these do become better and better reference tools if you need to look up historical facts, although in 1999 with the internet and the changes in how wrestling perceives itself, that PWI frame of reference where matches are shoots and titles are real. I love the column about how New Japan Wrestling must not be any good because a guy like Yuji Nagata is a star and he couldn't win any matches in WCW. Seems so antiquated. Actually, those mags today are a million times better than they once were. My favorite thing about them every year continues to be the heights and weights. I mean, they've had Scott Steiner at 235 pounds for the past 10 years, and have Stevie Ray shorter than Johnny Grunge when there is probably 8 inches difference in height between the two of them. Some of the heights and weights are a ride, although Steiner for some reason cracks me up the most. Apparently there is going to be a new mag which has just been released called World of Wrestling that wants to cover everything straight and be like Rolling Stone is to the music industry that has just been released. Independent Wrestling Federation on March 20th in Nutley, New Jersey at the high school has Nova vs. Danny during On Top. The New York Post on February 21st ran a story on Bob Backlund running for office and that Jerry Lawler was considering doing so. They also brought up former wrestler Johnny DeFazio out of Pittsburgh running for the Allegheny County Council and Harry Venus as the mayor of Davie, Florida. Venus really has only done a few wrestling matches as a gimmick being mayor as opposed to the others who were genuine pro wrestlers running for political office. I love this paragraph in a story on politics. Backlund said he faced Ventura about 10 times and never lost, but sketchy WWF records show a 1981 loss to the Body by disqualification. Geez, if those guys who 18 years ago that people would be quoting their wins and losses, nobody would have ever done jobs. Shoichi Funaki, who lives in San Antonio, is wrestling on indie shows with Pete Lothario, Jose's son, in that area. Iqua has its 3rd annual Super 8 tournament, patterned after the J-Cup shows in Japan, on February 27th at St. Matthew's Parish Center with Ace Darling, Reckless Youth, Jeff Hardy, Matt Hardy, Devin Storm, Christopher Daniels, Christian York, and Jeff Peterson. Billy Graham suffered a fractured left femur this week and will both be having the femur repaired and have surgery to replace his latest left hip, number 7, on February 26th. Graham had been scheduled for the surgery since November, but had it postponed a few months because he needed to tend to his wife, who was battling cancer, but the injury this week made the surgery a necessity immediately. Jason Sanderson, the wrestler and now promoter known as the Wolfman, famous for his $66 million Powerball jackpot, is running a New England wrestling reunion on August 6th and August 7th in Epping, New Hampshire. For anyone who ever worked in that area interested in details, contact Tom Burke at 413-733-6015. The February 19th to 26th issue of Entertainment Weekly ran a listing of the 100 greatest moments in TV history with 3 pro wrestling listings. At number 45 was the debut of Gorgeous George on network TV on November 11, 1947. Number 93 was the 1982 Jerry Lawler-Andy Kaufman angle on The David Letterman Show. And number 100 was the 1976 episode of The $6 Million Man where Andre the Giant played Bigfoot. Guaranteed if this same list was put together 2 years ago, none of the three would make that list. Thanks to Jim Ward for this addendum to the Masa Saito career title list. In 1981, Masa Saito held the Alabama heavyweight title, winning it from Ray Candy and losing it to Ron Fuller. Pennsylvania Championship Wrestling is moving its home base from Reading, Pennsylvania to Hamburg, Pennsylvania, and will run its shows at the Hamburg Fieldhouse, the site of WWF television tapings in the 70s and 80s, with the first show on April 16. The February 21 Los Angeles Times ran a story about the late Leo Seltzer, the inventor of roller derby, who died in 1978. Seltzer invented it in 1935, and it became huge from 1948 to 1951, when it was in prime time on network TV. He became disgusted with it as it fell from popularity, and turned it over to his son Gerald, who promoted the second boom period in the 60s out of San Francisco. Many times in the 70s his son had to talk him out of trying to restart his invention, which had pretty well fallen off the map of the earth, and he had finally decided he was going to do it despite the best efforts of his brother and son to tell him it was a bad idea in 1978, and then he died. It barely mentioned the current product except to say Jerry Seltzer is commissioner of Roller Jam. As far as Roller Jam is concerned, the February 12th episode was down to an 0.8 rating. They will be introducing a new team next week called the Las Vegas Hot Dice, as they've been running the same 3 teams every week on television since it started. There is becoming a minimal amount of interest in it due to the pretty girls on the California Quakes, Stacy Blitch in particular, but it's still like independent pro wrestling with a big budget and really awful storylines. None of the men have a charisma, and Sean Atkinson just doesn't have it to be the top male star. But he's the only one who could possibly be pushed, and nobody else is even close, as Mark D'Amato comes across as a really bad Goldberg, and Richard Brown, even if he doesn't look it, is in his early 50s. The problems with Brown from a few weeks back have all been smoothed out, and at games taped this past weekend, which should air in a few weeks, Brown was said to have been motivated and stole the show. There was more local interest in the tapings, with hundreds of fans turned away, and they've tweaked the game starting in a few weeks to include more fighting and more exploitation of the women sexually. The referees have been told not to break up the fights quickly. They did a spot where the men were skating short on the babyface Sundogs, and Denise Loden had to skate for the men and nearly had her jersey ripped off, which apparently drew a huge pop from the crowd, so expect more clothes-tearing spots to be incorporated in. The idea of doing a national tour this summer seems to have been scrapped for now. They also did an angle where Pazzi and Suzanne Chalin, who are from Europe, were doing a lame deportation angle. MMA. Vitor Belfort suffered a knee injury in training and is pulled out of the March 5 UFC pay-per-view show, so the main event will be changed to Tito Ortiz vs. Guy Mezger. While there are never any guarantees about shoot matches, this match, if talk has anything to do with it, promises to be one of the all-time classic grudge matches in UFC history, and there are some interesting stories. Mezger and Ortiz met on May 30, 1997 in Augusta, Georgia in the finals of an under 200-pound tournament. In Mezger's first-round match, he won an 18-minute decision over Christoph Leninger, a nationally ranked judo player. In Ortiz's first-round match, he destroyed an overmatched Wesley Alberton in seconds in an alternates match. Enson Inoue, who was the other first-round match, was injured and unable to face Mezger, so Ortiz moved into the final. Ortiz took Mezger down and held him in a cradle while continually kneeing him in the back of his head. Mezger was cut in the back of his head. Ref John McCarthy ordered a stand-up to check the cut, which got Mezger out of a bad position. When Ortiz went in for a second takedown, Mezger caught him coming in with a front guillotine and got the tap in just 2 minutes. Since that time there have been a lot of words back and forth. Ortiz, who has major league charisma, was very successful at the January 8th show in handing a major beating to a favored Jerry Bolander, a teammate of Mezger's. At the weigh-in the night before that show, when Ortiz saw him, he said something to the effect of, "Look, there's Guy Mezger." A lot of people have felt since that fight that Ortiz was robbed because McCarthy shouldn't have stopped the fight to check a cut from the back of the head, since there is no danger of that kind of a cut bleeding into the eye, which is the reason most fights are stopped for blood. However, one can't necessarily fault McCarthy due to all the scrutiny UFC was under and still is. Ortiz got a bad break, and he was choked out after receiving a bad break. Mesger may have escaped the predicament and may not have, and it's a subject that has been debated since that match. Mesger has since gone on to win King of Pancrase, and this is his first UFC match back since the tournament. Ortiz wrestled for a while at national powerhouse Cal State Bakersfield, but is no longer at the school and trains in Vale Tudo and boxing. The reason Ortiz wasn't on this show to begin with is because he injured his right hand in the Bolander fight and he's not at 100%. Ortiz agreed to take this fight, partially because of the Mesger grudge, and partially because Semaphore Entertainment Group promised to make it clear on the show that he was coming in with a hand injury, and that he only had a little more than 2 weeks' notice to get ready for the fight, basically to make it a null-say situation in a sense for him. The potential drawback for Semaphore Entertainment Group is that Ortiz has real charisma, and based on his performance against Bolander, is the real thing. A loss, particularly going into a fight where he's not 100% and facing a real fighter, could hurt him as far as a marquee deal in some people's eyes, even with the excuse. More importantly, fighting a real top-class fighter with a bad right hand and not being in top condition for someone whose main offense is his punches is not only risking making the injury worse, but somewhat dangerous to the healing of the hand unless it's not used. And a one-handed fighter against Guy Mesger is a tough way to go. Mesger claims that the only reason he was taken down in the first place is he had just finished an 18-minute war, which he did, and only had 20 minutes rest while Ortiz came in basically fresh. After seeing the home video version of the K1 Grand Prix show, it is no wonder why on a worldwide basis they are the only true competition for WWF in the sports entertainment field. Kenji Kusatsu, a former rugby star at Nippon College, has started training for K1. After graduating college, he entered Seto Kaikon Karate and captured the East Japan B-Class Championship. Where his name may be familiar is that his father wrestled as the Great Kusatsu for the Iway in Japan and the AWA in the United States in the 70s. Also saw a match from Jeff Osborne's Hook and Shoot promotion in Evansville, Indiana, where in a Shoot Valley Tudo rules match, a power bomb off a triangle was used as a finisher and the guy who got bombed was knocked out legit. There was another of those combination MMA and boxing shows on February 17th in Davenport, Iowa, with Laverne Clark of some UFC undercard scoring an MMA win in 208 with punches from the mount over James Johnson, and MMA competitor Travis Fulton winning a boxing match in 25 seconds via KO over Jamie Schell. Over this past weekend at the Nordvist Cup in Norway, an international amateur wrestling tournament, Randy Couture placed 5th at 214 and Dan Henderson placed 3rd at 187. Among the names in the Abu Dhabi World Submission Wrestling World Championships from February 24th to February 26th are 143 Joao Roque, Shudo EFC Royler Gracie, 156 Andre Pedernerias, Shudo Contenders Eddie Ruiz, Kingdom, Fabiano Iha, Hayato Sakurai Shudo, Jean-Jacques Machado, Shudo, John Lewis, EFC Shudo, Kaoru Uno, Shudo, Robin Gracie, Rumina Sato, Shudo, 191 Akira Gono, Shudo Akira Shoji, Pride, Amuri Bittetti, UFC, Robbie Kilpatrick, Ken Shamrock's real-life brother Egan Inoue, Rings, Fabio Gurgel, UFC, Omar Bauchi, Pancrase, Renato Verissimo, Henzo Gracie, 215 Jerry Bolander, UFC, Regan Machado, Murillo Bustamante, Roberto Traven, UFC, Sanae Kikuta, Pride, Vernon White, Pancrase, and heavyweight Carlos Barreto, UFC, Chris Hazaman, Rings, Gary Myers, EFC, Mark Kerr, UFC/Pride, Ricardo Moraes, Rings, Sean Alvarez, Rings, Travis Fulton, Pancrase/Extreme Challenge, Trey Telligman, UFC/Pancrase. ECW. The latest on Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch is that they did post a message on the internet basically saying that they were undergoing help for family problems, and that they had drug problems in the past but no longer did. The two have been suspended without pay by ECW for the past month. Paul Heyman's response to the post was to say that he felt they did it to placate him and that before he would bring them back they both would need to seek out immediate help. There were 2 house shows during the week, with January 18th in Johnstown, Pennsylvania drawing 1,175 and January 19th in Rostraver, Pennsylvania drawing 2,000. There was no television tape this week. Shane Douglas worked both shows forming a tag team with Tommy Dreamer as a face. Jason Knight broke his neck from a Chris Chetty powerbomb. He had originally broken the neck in 1991 and had surgery in 1993 to fuse two vertebrae when working as a jobber for WCW. He was in tremendous pain all weekend in both the neck and shoulders, but had no numbness or paralysis. The actual reason Masato Tanaka didn't appear on the January 10th pay-per-view is because he didn't have complete paperwork completed by ECW. He had been working on a tourist visa for all of 1998, and because they were starting to ask questions at immigration because he was flying back and forth so often, he wanted to get a working visa and ECW didn't come through on time with it. Paul Heyman was still trying to get him at the last minute, going over FMW's head, as MW was insisting upon the paperwork being completed. Takamichi Inoku himself expected to be in ECW and on that pay-per-view show as well. He was led to believe he'd be brought in, but to this day is still waiting to hear from Heyman. This past week's TV was from Queens, and because of crowd heat, it's one of the best buildings to produce TV. The crowd was live for everything. The show contained almost no wrestling and was built around two angles: the Mustafa return and turn on New Jack, and the first angle involving Douglas and Dreamer versus Justin Credible and Lance Storm. The show opened with Sid destroying John Kronus and Steve Corino. Crowd went nuts to a sick degree. Chetty beat Little Guido in a good short match with his double springboard moonsault. They did good mat work and Chetty's wrestling looked real good. Then came lengthy angle number 1. Bubba Ray Dudley started running down Public Enemy for not showing up. Can you imagine how much TV time was spent to building up this angle only to get almost nothing out of it? He called Rocco too old and Grunge too high and too fat. The Gangstas ran in, but Mustafa turned on New Jack, and Joel Gertner made it clear that Mustafa was the one paying off the Dudleys to injure both New Jack and Public Enemy, as Mustafa was in the ring paying everyone off. Dudleys and Mustafa also laid out Cronus and Spike Dudley. He was referred to as Mr. Mustafa, which seemed to be a spoof on Mr. McMahon. When ECW does stuff like that, which is copying the major league angles, is where it looks so minor league. Overall, the angle was good. Second angle saw Douglas tease a retirement announcement before Storm and Credible came out. Credible whacked Francine with a cane and she bled. Dreamer came out and got nailed as well. This was a really good angle, particularly the mic work by Douglas. He made reference to Ultimo Dragon, saying he has the same injury Dragon has that ended his career. He tried to put over his match with Taz as a classic from ECW Arena with the idea of it being the kind of match he could leave the business with, proud of his last match. He made a reference to him previously knocking wrestlers who stayed around too long, although didn't mention Flair's name as he had done in the past in those situations. Jasmine St. Clair, a porno actress, will be coming in to work some TVs in the March 21st pay-per-view show, probably in a role similar to what Jenna Jameson did last year. She's scheduled to appear on Stern the week of the pay-per-view to promote the card, and they'll do some sort of an angle with her. WCW. For the uncensored pay-per-view on March 14th in Louisville, 3 matches that appear to be on the show include some sort of Hogan vs. Flair gimmick match that will probably be non-title, allowing Flair to win, probably a non-title Benoit and Malenko vs. Wyndham, and heading match involving a belt, maybe a strap match or country whipping match, and a Harlem Street fight with Stevie Ray vs. Vince. Nitro on February 22nd in Sacramento before a sellout 13,921 paying $220,149 opened with 2 storyline videos. In one, which isn't really storyline, Ricky Rackman did segments at Cal, a college that really isn't all that close to Sacramento at all, with the Nitro girls, and he'll be doing college campus Nitro parties for the next 5 weeks to build up to the Panama City annual spring break show at Club La Vela. The other was one of those silly black and white skits where all the members, except Stevie Ray for some reason, thank God, because that would mean we'd need another skit, told Scott Norton, returning from Japan. It would assume we all know he was in Japan, but it was never actually said where he was, other than he was beating up Sonny Onu's ugly cousins of something, that Hollywood put them in charge. Finally he confronted Hollywood, who told him they all had a chance and blew it, and that he was putting Norton in charge. It really wasn't funny the first time. Jerry Flynn pinned Mike Enos with an armbar in 4:17. Good heat and a good match between 2 underrated wrestlers. Bam Bam Bigelow pinned Van Hammer with the Greetings from Asbury Park in 9:02. Too long and boring. They did a Bagwell and Scott Steiner video of them picking up on a blonde at a health club, and they had this big van with them painted on it to go to spring break. It wound up with Scott yelling at Goldberg during a photo session. Booker T pinned Bret Hart in 17:45 with a reverse cradle pin. This was one of those deals where the great crowd response made it an excellent match. Psychology and execution were great, but these type of long matches often don't get great response today, but the Sacramento crowd was going crazy for the subtleties. Disco Inferno beat Kaz Hayashi in 6-0-1 with the stunner. Disco sung the national anthem, which was funny. Hayashi came out wearing Glacier's old outfit, which wasn't funny. Hayashi may be retarded, but he sure can work. Steiner and Bagwell did an interview where Steiner challenged Goldberg for later in the show. It was probably the best interview of Steiner's life, and he definitely got the best crowd response. Hugh Morris pinned Chris Jericho with a moonsault when Perry Saturn interfered and gave Jericho a Death Valley driver in 6:58. Before helping Jericho, Saturn decked Jimmy Hart. After the match, Morris attacked Saturn, I guess, for helping him actually beat a name wrestler for the first time in his life. Rey Mysterio Jr. pinned Kevin Nash in 2:40. Nash had him up for the powerbomb and Mysterio Jr. punched him in the head a few times and landed on top for the pin. It was like the fastest 3 count in history. The crowd popped big while Tenay and Shivani tried to sell it as if it was the biggest upset in the history of Nitro. I think Heenan was just enjoying happy hour. They debuted a second Conan music video. Ernest Miller did an interview that took forever, eventually challenging Norton, who came out and destroyed him in 139 with a power bomb. Not nearly as good as their previous match, but nothing wrong with it. Goldberg beat Steiner via DQ in 7:51. Superheat. Goldberg nearly got whiplashed when his head fell between the ropes. Bagwell beat up ref Johnny Boone for the DQ. Rick Steiner ended up doing a run-in attacking Bagwell and Goldberg, and Rick chased the two off. The show ended with 2 ratings-killing videos. The first was the Nitro girls on location in bikinis. A real weakness of Nash writing television is he doesn't seem to have a clue about positioning. It seems he thought seeing babes in bikinis, since wrestlers live the strip club lifestyle, would mean more than a main event to build to at the end of the show. But if that was the case, a TV show called The Best of LA Strippers would be doing 4.5s on cable, and it isn't. Then, after building the entire show around a Rick vs. David Flair confrontation, showing videos of Tori Wilson, who was given that as a wrestling ring name, or at least called by that name by Disco Inferno, building up David's courage. Instead of showing that, the NWO pirated the signal and showed a video of David and Tori making out while Nash did his Arn Anderson imitation, amusing in spots but too long. Hogan did a Flair imitation, amusing on paper but not in execution. Disco was Mean Gene. Actually, he was real good. And Hall was Piper. I guess in the future when Hall has bad matches on TV we can just excuse them by saying he was simply trying to be Piper. Rick Rude was at the Nitros on February 1st and February 8th but hasn't been back since. Bugsy McGraw was backstage at the February 15th Nitro in Tampa, as was Rocky Johnson. You don't want to know how much money that awful skit where Flair was beaten cost between the helicopters and everything else. Lex Luger had his bicep surgery during the week. He was telling people right until the end that he was going to do the show, but he couldn't. Will Sasso was a wrestling fan from childhood. He expected to do a tag match with Piper as his partner against Bischoff and Hart, but when he got to Tampa, he was told Piper wasn't coming in for the show. Actually, Piper got pulled from the match to wrestle Hogan. Apparently he's always wanted to do a match and it was a dream come true for him, but he was scared to death having to do a singles match. Hart was on Mad TV again, taped February 19th, which I believe will air on February 27th, doing an arm wrestling match with Sasso. WCW ran a house show on February 19th at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, scheduled with Goldberg vs. Luger and Sting vs. Hart. With Luger hurt, first Nash was put in the spot, but Nash pulled out, leaving Bigelow in the spot. The idea was that none of the matches at the Cow Palace would be on the pay-per-view because it's the same market, but it wound up with Benoit and Malenko vs. Hall and Nash changed when Hall and Nash pulled out, putting Hennig and Wyndham in the spot, which was the same match, and Steiner vs. Page wound up the same. Booker T beat Jericho in the best match on the show. Wyndham and Hennig beat Malenko and Benoit again when Hennig pinned Benoit with a fisherman's suplex in a match that was about the same as their pay-per-view match. Steiner pinned Page after hitting him with the title belt in a match similar to but not as good as the pay-per-view match. Goldberg did Leno and Hart did Mad TV that day, and both were scheduled to be chartered to the show. Bischoff, who was also in Hollywood, was supposed to be on the same plane. Hart and Goldberg were waiting in the plane for Bischoff to arrive for a long time, so long that by the time they got to San Francisco, the show was basically over. They were rushed from the airport to the Cow Palace while WCW had taken 2 intermissions and ran the undercard matches long. Bigelow actually went on the house mic and said that Goldberg and Hart hadn't arrived and challenged anyone in the back. Sting, wearing his white face paint, came out to booze, because fans wanted to see Goldberg. Sting looked rusty, and while the guys tried, it was a sluggish real long match. Finally Hart and Goldberg arrived. Hart ran out there, which was Sting's signal to pin Bigelow. The two double-teamed Sting and Goldberg, who like Hart was in his clothes and simply ripped off the shirt backstage he wore on Leno, hit the ring and speared Hart and Bigelow and pinned Bigelow, while Sting used the Scorpion Death Drop on Hart in a melee that went about 1 minute. Fans left not really mad, but really confused. Thunder on February 18th in Salt Lake City drew a sellout 9,159, paying $197,089. The show also drew a 3.79 rating and 5.7 share. Disco and Hall did an interview that got no heat. Lash LaRue beat Chavo Guerrero Jr. via DQ in 6:54 when Chavo punched the ref. Kidman made the save, but Chavo gave him a tornado DDT on the floor. Jericho came out with Ralphus wearing a dress, which was the funniest thing in Nitro history. Jericho beat Juventud Guerrera in 6:15 with a Lion Tamer in a real good match. Ralphus went at one point to kiss Juvie. I'm sure there's a story there that I don't want to know. Bagwell and Steiner did an interview where Scott said he wanted a stip added that if he wins over Page at the pay-per-view, he gets Kimberly for 30 days. Steiner beat Bobby Blaze in 1:16 with a recliner. Blaze was carried out on a stretcher and Steiner knocked over the stretcher. Conan and Mysterio Jr. beat Silver King and Hector Garza in 2:40 when Mysterio Jr. pinned King after a Hurricane Rana. Crowd went totally nuts for this match, which was doubly impressive since they didn't for anyone else on the show. WCW must be blind not to see anything in Garza. Flynn upset Booker T with a spin kick in 4:28 when Disco interfered and gave T the stunner outside the ring. Flynn looked real good. Gene interviewed Flair, who blew off the Monday angle almost not acknowledging it. He apparently hated it, then was low-key. He was told not to do the typical Flair interview, and ended real weak. Good interview if it had been someone else, but way below par for Flair. Finally Benoit and Malenko beat Horace Hogan and Bryan Adams in 12:53 of a cage match. This was actually very good. Crowd wasn't that hot for it early, but it got good enough that they cared. Vince came out. Fans hated that. There was a ref bump. Some chairs ended up in the cage. The door opened and Benoit was outside. Malenko was getting killed. Talk about suspension of disbelief. With the door wide open in front of him, Benoit needed to climb to the top of the cage and delivered a headbutt off the top onto Hogan and Malenko pinned him. If this was WWF, I'd have seen 4,000 replays of it already and the announcers wouldn't shut up about. Since it was WCW, it was mentioned once on Nitro and never shown again. For the show that airs on February 26th, it was Hardcore Hawk, Jim Sandman Fullington's new ring name, beating Damien. Kevin Sullivan asked him for a ring name that afternoon since the geniuses running the company still hadn't come up with one. He said his nickname was Hack, so there you go. Psicosis pinned Garza. So there you go. Mysterio Jr. and Conan were scheduled against Enos and Riggs. When I heard about this match, I figured they were planning on taping the match with Mysterio Jr. with the mask on to fool people on the internet into thinking Liz would lose her hair. Actually, I spent far too much time thinking about ideas that make sense for this company. They booked it with nobody on the committee realizing that Mysterio Jr. would lose the mask this weekend, so he'd not have it for this match. Once the bookers were asked if Ray should go out with or without the mask, they realized the blunder and canceled the match. Miller beat Ray when Vince's interference backfired. Raven and Canyon, with Chastity as their valet, beat Villano 5 and Dandy. Guerrera beat Blitzkrieg in what was said to have been a good match. TV Main saw Hart beat Disco with the sharpshooter in a real long match. Goldberg beat Bigelow quick in a dark match. While they were doing the Flair beating in Tampa, in the building they had a Dark Smiley vs. Chavo match that Smiley won. There was some heat back and forth regarding the February 15th Tampa Nitro. WCW basically gave the show as a favor by Harvey Schiller to George Steinbrenner. Steinbrenner then didn't even show up for his own show, and instead attended the ESPY Awards that night. Steinbrenner's people were mad at WCW and complained afterwards to the office about the quality of the show, and in specific, about Goldberg not being there. Eddie Guerrero was also backstage at that show. Notice how his name never gets mentioned. Hogan is trying to figure ways to bring Chuck Zito more into the WCW storylines. Villano Quattro was getting his neck checked on in Atlanta this past week. He's able to do lightweight work and the doctors estimated he was 3 to 4 months away from returning. Garza ripped his scrotum in the Thunder match with Psicosis to add to his already bad knee from a botched-up operation. February 16th WCW Saturday night tapings in Lakeland, Florida drew 2,141 paying $42,640. February 19th SF Cow Palace show drew 6,897 paying $162,630. Merchandise for the past week, not including the pay-per-view show, was $196,787 or $6.13 per head. Ultimo Dragon got a second elbow operation in Japan to make up for the botched original one, with Garza, Dragon, and Rick Steiner. That makes 3 botched-up operations by the WCW doctors, which I guess in some weird way is apropos for the organization. Dragon decided against having a third operation. He's hinted at retiring but is hopeful of being able to return, but that's at least 6 more months to 1 year away, and it's a question if he ever can. Right now he's concentrating on promoting, and people were raving about his first Japanese tour. Scott Hall was run over after the pay-per-view show. He was outside a bar and kind of fell down. Wes Benton, a WCW employee, didn't see him behind him and backed out, and heard a scream. Benton stopped the car, which was on top of Hall's ankle. He realized and moved the car off the ankle. It was nothing serious, although it's probably why Hall didn't wrestle on Nitro the next night. The original pilot for the Telemundo show won't be airing after all. The Telemundo show, which started February 24th, a 7 p.m. time slot, which is a tremendous slot, will consist of 3 matches from the Nitro taped 9 days earlier with Spanish voiceovers using Armando Quintero, a Spanish-language announcer for the Dallas Cowboys who was described to me as having Jim Ross potential, and Conan as the announcers. Mike Graham is back working with the company as a road agent and helping come up with finishes. Chris Jericho may be leaning toward leaving based on recent activities and the lack of pushes for the guys on his level. Signing Jericho is actually considered something of a big deal at Titan. February 11th, Thunder did a 3.48 rating and 5.4 share, while WCW Saturday Night on February 20th did a 2.8 rating. We don't have Saturday night ratings for February 13th. The February 26th Alamodome House show had sold 12,456 tickets for $313,720 at press time. Nitro on March 1st in Chapel Hill had sold out to the tune of $17,092, paying $375,100. March 4th Thunder in Winston-Salem had a week advance, no doubt due to the fact fans always leave the shows demoralized. March 19th Chicago House show has already sold 11,580 tickets, and March 27th in Auburn Hills, Michigan, both with Hogan vs. Flair, has sold 10,813. A deal for Wrestling with Shadows to be released at Blockbusters and other video stores is just about complete. The version that will be at the stores will be a 2-hour tape. The movie itself was 90 minutes, with the final 30 minutes added being an update to the story 1 year later. A deal is also apparently just about complete for a major motion picture with real actors playing the roles of Hart, McMahon and everyone else, based on the story. Told you this story was never going away. Major house shows for June: June 4th House Show in Cincinnati, June 7th Nitro in Cleveland, June 8th Saturday Night Taping in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, June 10th Thunder in Syracuse, New York, June 11th House Show in Buffalo, June 13th Great American Bash Pay-Per-View in Baltimore, June 14th Nitro at MCI Center in Washington, D.C., June 21st Nitro at the Superdome in New Orleans, June 22nd Saturday Night Taping in Alexandria, Louisiana, June 24th Thunder in Lafayette, Louisiana, June 25th House Show in Auburn Hills, Michigan, June 27th House Show in Milwaukee, and June 28th Nitro in Chicago at United Center. Expect more angles in the future involving the Nitro girls, although Tori Wilson may make them in angles almost obsolete. Some talk that Wilson will wind up, after dumping poor naive David Flair, with Steiner. DDP is going to be off for several weeks, following the injury. Billy Kidman's contract has expired. Enos is working on a sprained ankle. Riggs may need elbow surgery. There was a lot of heat stemming from the recent Jenny Jones show. Didn't see the show, but apparently indie wrestler Rasta the Voodoo Man really outwitted Bagwell and wound up as the star of the show, causing WCW to attempt to get Rasta's stuff edited off the show.
WWF, the WrestleMania lineup appears to be Rock vs. Austin as a single main event, possibly White vs. Mankind, Undertaker vs. Bossman in a Hell in a Cell match, that should break the 4 stars plus streak, the IC title match, which may be either a 3-way with Venus, Billy Gunn and Shamrock, to a 4-way, Sable vs. Luna for the women's title, Shane McMahon vs. X-Pac for the European title. McMahon is training every day under Tom Pritchard for this match. Kane vs. Triple H, a hardcore title match with Holly vs. Road Dogg or possibly Al Snow, a Brawl for All with Bart Gunn vs. Butterbean. This hasn't been finalized, but Butterbean was in Birmingham at the tapings attempting to finish negotiations for the match and a tag team battle royal.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre appears to have done 450,000 buys, or a 1.21 buy rate, which would be a $5.79 million company gross. It's the biggest buy rate ever for an in-your-house event, but that is hardly a surprise with a McMahon vs. Austin cage match on top after being built up for most of the year. In comparison, the De La Hoya fight the night before did 675,000 buys and grossed $11.61 million as the promoter's cut. I guess we won't be hearing this week that McMahon or Austin are the biggest drawing cards on pay-per-view. We probably will again next month since WrestleMania will almost certainly do 800,000 buys. The sketchy details we had for the Chattanooga tapings on February 16th were all screwed up. The show drew a sellout 7,900 paying $158,570. For Super Astros, Armando Fernandez and Miguel Perez and Felino beat Apollo Dantes and Papi Chulo and El Merenguero, and in a minis match Jarrito and Battalion, the former Piratita Morgan, who is the slowest mini in history as his agility is nearly Mabel-like, beat Nova and Max Mini. For Shotgun, Hardy Boys beat Roger Hill, Southern indie wrestler Roger Anderson, and Frank Parker. Tiger Ali Singh beat Mark Kyle and Triple H beat Buddy Landel, who looked really heavy. Heat, which aired on February 21st, opened with McMahon talking about the envelope and ordering an Inferno match for Raw. DOA and Too Much beat Oddities, with George Steele as the fourth man, with draws doing color. Godfather beat Ken Shamrock via countout when Shamrock jumped out to fight Billy Gunn, who came out with Ryan Shamrock, a Texas stripper whose first name is Ryan, which as mentioned before, is also the name of Shamrock's oldest son. This Ryan can't act to save her life. Shane McMahon beat Gillberg in 24 seconds. Gillberg speared Shane, but Shane KO'd him with the belt for the pin. After the match, Gillberg tried to spear Chyna and bounced off and fell down. X-Pac challenged McMahon to a match, but Chyna said he'd have to beat her first on Raw. Snow beat D'Lo Brown when Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett both attacked him. Mankind did an interview asking to be the second ref in the Austin Rock WrestleMania title match. Mankind is legit all banged up and talked about maybe not lasting another year. He said he couldn't be a mailman because his legs don't look good enough. He couldn't be a pilot because he doesn't like the taste of hard liquor. And he couldn't go to WCW because he isn't old enough. Kevin Kelly then chimed in saying he's only 33, so he's not even halfway old enough for WCW. Finally, Viscera no contest Big Boss Man when the Ministry and Corporation ran in immediately, and thank God for that. Undertaker used his magical powers to set the ring on fire, leaving the Corporation stuck in the ring. Terry Taylor did the announcing with Kelly. He seemed a little rusty and nervous. Taylor is only filling in for McMahon on weeks when McMahon is going to wrestle. So it isn't like he's being replaced. A few weeks back there was a suggestion to replace McMahon with Jim Cornette, since he did a good job. But Cornette is in the political doghouse, particularly with Vince Russo, who writes the TV, and Kevin Dunn, who produces the shows, so he's not about to get any high-profile breaks these days. Raw opened with Vince starting out doing a face interview hyping Mania before bringing out White. He's had a lot of fat sculpted from his body, but he still looks like he hasn't slept in a week. Instead of the fire-breathing fierce giant they're looking for, they've got this tall, burned-out looking overgrown high school partier. The company has impressed upon White the idea of dropping weight, actually down to below 400 eventually. They are calling him Big Nasty Paul White, Big Nasty being the former nickname for Angelo Mosca, a pro wrestler in the 70s and early 80s who was a big star around Ontario. White and Rock argued and Mankind suggested a title match between the two of them with he and ref. McMahon didn't want it, but both guys acted like they wanted it. Public Enemy beat Gangrel and Edge via DQ in 124 when Christian interfered. Didn't take long for PE to look bad. They don't take bumps. Grunge has put on even more weight, and both looked real slow. They got no reaction. Lights went out and they were covered with blood. Gunn vs. Shamrock for the number one contender spot ended with a no contest in 438 when Venus interfered and they did a three-way brawl. Sable did another heel interview calling Terry Pac called Tori, so now we've got two Tories in different promotions out of the crowd. Sable called her pathetic and Luna turned face to save the day as the hero to all the women who aren't as pretty as Sable. Sable wound up giving both real weak belt shots. Brown challenged Hart and Jarrett to a handicap match. They've toned down to the point when Brown used the word pissed. It was bleeped out. PMS came out and Jacqueline dropkicked Brown off the top rope into a Hart spin kick for the pin in 326. Rock vs. White wound up with both turning on Mankind and giving him a beating. Steve Blackman beat Draws in 312 with a high kick, but Draws attacked him with his glow sticks after the match. Undertaker threatened Vince in one of his silly interviews. Goldust won a non-title match over Val Venus when Blue Meanie ran in, but DDT's Venus on the floor in 3:59 leading to the pin. Goldust looked confused that Meanie helped him. Don't the bookers clue anyone in on their angles? Bob Holly beat Bart Gunn in a surprisingly good and wild hardcore title match in 8:16. Gunn has dropped considerable weight from about 275 to 240 and has a totally different but every bit as uncharismatic look, but his work after 2 Japan tours showed improvement. Both worked hard bashing each other with objects like a water pitcher, a glass mug, a ring bell, fire extinguisher sprays, a crate of bananas, a suplex and a DDT on the ramp and garbage can shots. It wound up with this silly-looking character, Steve Williams, dressed up like a Japanese wrestler with this awful dime store Halloween mask throwing Bart off the ramp through a table where he was pinned. The masked guy wasn't identified as Williams, although the previous week on Memphis TV he was wearing the same mask and said he'd wear it until he won the WWF title. Given the way this gimmick looked, he's going to be wearing it for a long time with that stipulation. They should call it the Mask of Death, because it would kill the career of anyone in it. X-Pac pinned Chyna in 108 when Triple H ran in and hit Chyna with a pedigree. They really didn't even attempt to do a match. Finally, Undertaker beat Kane in the Inferno match when Kane's boot caught on fire in 6:51. Vince did color. Nothing even resembling their pay-per-view match from last year. Paul Bearer gave Vince a present which was a teddy bear. Vince went crazy and hysterical and started overacting again, particularly when Undertaker set the teddy bear on fire. Everyone figures this is an angle that has something to do with Undertaker getting Stephanie McMahon, Vince's daughter who is 22 or 23, to join the ministry. After the cameras were turned off, Austin came out and drank beer and Rock came out. They teased they were going to drink beer together but Austin stunned him. WWF The Music Volume 3 dropped from number 15 to number 18 on the Billboard charts this past week, although it actually increased sales to 73,566 from 71,305. The Slammin' Wrestling Hits, which is the subject of legal controversy, was at number 125 with 11,487 units sold. The episode of That 70s Show with Rock, Shamrock, Ernie Ladd and Hardy Boys drew an 8.5 rating, which is the highest rating ever for that show. Austin taped 2 TV commercials for MCI and appears on February 26 on the TV show Nash Bridges. Officially, the ratings for Monday Night Football this past season fell 7% to a 13.9 average, the lowest average in the 20-plus year history of the show. NFL officials blamed the decline on the earlier starting time and more blowout games. Nobody would acknowledge that wrestling had anything to do with the decline. Foley is doing a movie called Big Time Hustler scheduled as a low-budget film for a small-time April release. Nothing at all to the rumors of WWF doing an Austin vs. Gillberg match on Raw. The shows in Puerto Rico saw February 11th in Carolina draw 4,200 and February 12th in Ponce drew 4,600. Both shows did about a $60,000 house. The profit margin was cut way back due to the American Airlines problems as Victor Quiñones had to charter a jet to get the wrestlers into Sunrise, Florida, which cost $22,000. LOD worked the tour as a last-minute replacement for the New Age Outlaws. Road Dogg missed due to the rehab, and he should be back at the TV tapings this coming week. Billy Gunn simply decided he didn't want to go after agreeing to the date. LOD has a long time left on their contract, although WWF doesn't seem to have any plans on doing anything with them. The May tour by Quiñones was canceled when WWF booked Austin and Undertaker on domestic house shows, and the company decided to promote shows in Puerto Rico on its own. The Quiñones shows are IWA shows, and he books the talent himself, running on days WWF doesn't have any shows. In early July, Quiñones may start his own small-time group as he has tentative TV tapings plans for April, mainly using the Mexicans that do Super Astros, Savio Vega and Miguel Perez as the top native stars, and Christopher Daniels from California. Takamichi Inoku may be brought back to work only the Super Astros shows as a heel tag team with Shoichi Funaki. Before negotiating the Severn deal, Inoki was trying to get Steve Williams to come to Japan for the March 14th date to put Ogawa over. WWF wasn't interested in sending its wrestlers over to do a high-profile job. The deal with Paul White was pretty well put together way back in December 1996. Brian Wickens' Luke Williams of the Bushwhackers was an intermediary to avoid tampering, helping set up White's agent Jim Strausser with McMahon. White told McMahon that Strausser had the right to negotiate with him so McMahon could avoid tampering, which would be the case with direct negotiations with White. The sides agreed back then to a 10-year deal at a little under $1 million per year. As best we can tell, the only part Hogan played in the deal was that whenever Giant was close to changing his mind, Hogan convinced him to take McMahon's deal because McMahon could make him a bigger star. The fact that Hogan has a rep for doing what is best for himself, and he wanted White on the other side for a 10-year deal, as opposed to, say, a 3-year deal where McMahon could make him and he could jump back, seems to indicate Hogan is looking for another run at some point. Earl Hebner told the newspaper in Richmond, Virginia that he is under a 5-year contract for high to mid six figures, like in $500,000 per year, which on the surface sounds ridiculous. He mentioned that both he and Dave Hebner received an offer from WCW to jump after the Montreal match and work an angle at Starrcade where Bret Hart would lay him out. He also claimed that he did swear on his kids and promise Hart that he wouldn't fast count him in that match, but claimed not to have broken the promise because it wasn't a fast count. House shows this week saw February 17th in Knoxville draw a sellout 5,997 paying $130,180. February 18th in Lexington drew 12,143 paying $254,883. February 19th in St. Louis drew a near sellout 17,261 paying $380,857. February 20th in New Haven drew a sellout 8,759 paying $185,356. And February 21st in Springfield, Massachusetts drew a sellout 8,174 paying $174,845. Merchandise for the week was $389,075 or $6.46 per head. Knoxville, with Austin and Undertaker off the show, was headlined by Rock over Mankind. St. Louis and Lexington were headlined by Rattlesnake Rules matches, which are basically tornado matches with Austin and Mankind over Rock and Kane, although they wound up almost like the Fatal 4-Way since everyone winds up fighting everyone. With Goldust out of action due to a bad back, expected back this weekend, they had Al Snow wrestle and Pinhead, which apparently was real goofy. In Springfield, because the guys were rushing to catch plans home that afternoon since it was the last show on the tour, the entire card, including intermission, went 95 minutes with Austin and Billy Gunn and Mankind over Rock and Bossman and Shamrock on top. Austin and Rock did a 7-minute post-match sketch with Hebner, with Austin and Hebner drinking beer together, Austin offering Rock a beer and stunning him 3 times. Also on the Stern Show, Austin said that his wife of 8 years, the former Jeannie Clark, who was originally married to Austin's original trainer Chris Adams in England, had just filed for divorce. That was a large part of the reason he missed that house show run 3 weeks ago. He made a comment that he was looking for women between the ages of 18 and 23. For this coming weekend, Boston at Fleet Center, Dayton and Cleveland for Raw are already sold out. Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh are both very close to sold out. Internet stories that Cleveland and Pittsburgh sold out in a few hours, or a few days, were both incorrect. The Sci-Fi Channel show Poltergeist, which has an episode starring Undertaker, will be moved to USA Network for one show on March 14th, which will air immediately after Heat and opposite WCW Uncensored. Kurt Angle is going to appear in some form at the Pittsburgh Raw taping. He may not appear on the live show. The Weekend Today show is doing a series on Angle starting out in pro wrestling, and they have training footage and indie matches, and they wanted a big-time match. So they figured the best place to tape it for the show was Pittsburgh, since that's his home city, and he's got a name locally. Mark Henry will be having his knee scoped and be out of action about 1 month. Jim Ross is hopeful of returning at WrestleMania, but again, that's not a definite. Expect Mark Merrow to be brought back after WrestleMania. At the pay-per-view, White was rolled under the ring in a large box just before the cage match started, as they were setting up the cage. Before the pay-per-view, there was an argument between Luna and Mark Merrow regarding Merrow's direction with Sable. Shawn Michaels did another interview in the San Antonio Free Press, saying he would never wrestle again. He also did a local TV interview, where one of the newscasters called him Steve Michaels, also saying he'll never wrestle again, and mentioned that he's no longer engaged and no longer has a girlfriend. For the weekend of February 20th to 21, Livewire did a 2.3 rating, Superstars did a 2.0, and Heat did a record 4.90. For February 13th to 14, Livewire did an all-time record 2.5. The Saturday Night Raw special did a 4.31 rating and 7.4 share. Superstars did a 2.1 and Heat did a 4.07. Speaking of that story that will never end, when Michaels was in Australia, he was asked if things ever get out of hand and if the hatred is ever real, and he brought up his rivalry with Bret Hart as spilling over to real life. He claimed he proved that the better man won because I'm still here and he isn't. The New York Daily News on February 22nd ran a story about the CD's success, saying the album makes flimsy teen stars and goofy novelty acts sound like the Beatles. The story claimed the album has sold more than 1 million copies over the last 6 weeks. Actual sales from 1 Feb. 29 through February 14 were 317,028. WWF is going to reissue its first album from 1985, which includes a cut by Jesse Ventura. Rich Baker, who worked under Ed Cohen in booking buildings and for a time ran the department when Cohen was battling cancer, was fired. He was asking for a raise from about $55,000 to $65,000 and was turned down, and then set up a meeting with Zane Bresloff, who promotes the arena events for WCW. When word got out he met with Bresloff, Linda McMahon fired him. Ref Jack Doan was also fired just before the Rumble. The Reader's Pages. Baba. Just wanted to congratulate you on another fine piece of the best wrestling journalism around, with your looking back at a true legendary wrestler and promoter, and not to mention a fine human being in Shohei Baba. Raw went to a commercial break, so I flipped over to TNT and thankfully was just in time to hear Mike Tenay address Baba's death to an audience where I'm sure a good percentage had no idea what a legendary figure he was, and who will always be remembered by those who respected him most for keeping traditional aspects of pro wrestling alive in an ever-changing sport. Maybe it will be a blessing in disguise and be a new rebirth of the promotion. Who knows what Mitsuharu Misawa is capable of. Ever since the turn of 1999, I've been reminiscing over the most memorable matches of the decade that is soon to come to a close before we know it. Toward the final words from Mr. Baba, you spoke of a match that I think means a lot more now in retrospect than anyone could have ever imagined at the time. I'm speaking of the Misawa vs. Jumbo Tsuruta match on June 24, 1990 at Budokan Hall. Talk about passing the torch. This match exemplified statements that come off as a joke in this country. At the time it may have been a 4.5-star match, but nearly 9 years later, it's way beyond 5 stars for more than just the clean pin finish, becoming the staple of the All Japan organization. That match marked the birth of probably the most consistent high-profile wrestler, the 1990s. Even though in the past few years, as you've mentioned, with Misawa taking it a little easier on house shows due to the brutal style, when it comes to being the focal point of the main event on big shows, not many men or women have ever worked to this degree. He is to this era what Flair was to the 80s. I think it's safe to assume that most of the best of this decade has already offered itself, considering that Shawn Michaels is probably done and Keiichi Yamada, Bret Hart, Misawa, Kenta Kobashi, Toshiaki Kawada, Manami Toyota, and Rey Mysterio Jr. have already seen their best years pass due to the physical toll they've endured. Every year there are some incredible matches that blow you away. Tenor with the Shooting Star Press. I was only 10 years old at the time. I never saw the match until 1997. At that time, after seeing the stuff Triple A had been doing with Mysterio Jr., Psicosis, Eddie Guerrero, etc. from 1993 to 1994, Sabu's first US run doing his insane high spots and table spots, this match couldn't be considered out of this world, except for seeing the finishing move and the removal of Liger's mask, exposing a second Crimson Mask. But at the time this was looked at by all as one of the most dazzling spectacles two wrestlers could possibly put together. The Liger-Sano matches were the next level of the Sayama Dynamite Kid series and preceded what was yet to come. I think both these matches should hold a distinctive spot for match of the 90s. I doubt Misawa vs. Tsuruta will. Too many have forgotten the importance it holds to this day. Sean Isla, Francois. Leesburg, Florida. Response from Dave Meltzer. I was actually at the Misawa-Tsuruta match and it was amazing because the post-match celebration of emotion from the audience, seeing thousands of people crying in joy, literally drenched in tears, was something I'll never forget. It wasn't a world title change, and I've seen many in the US and Japan, but I've never seen a world title change reaction that could come close. It was funny because before the match ever started, there was something in the crowd that I hadn't sensed at all that week, but even not knowing the language could feel, and that was just how over Misawa was in the building, and this was hours before the show started. But nobody expected him to beat Jumbo because that just wasn't the way All Japan did things in those days, as Jumbo was the superstar and this was Misawa's first ever singles Budokan main event. I remember that Baba gave the call that Misawa's hand is going up before the show that night, and the message was relayed to Tsuruta. Tsuruta, surprised but not upset, suggested it be via countout because, again, that's how the business was in those days. When the message came back, Baba didn't say a word, and sternly shook his head no. And the rest is history. I hadn't thought about this in years, but you're right, as important as this all seemed that night, it was all far more significant here 9 years later. Mushnick. The passing of Sam Mushnick was a loss for many wrestling fans in my age group. In the summer of 1964, The promotion here in New England, run by Tony Santos and Jack Pfeffer, ran a publicity story for an upcoming card at the Boston Garden stating that Jackie Fargo was the new NWA World Heavyweight Champion, claiming a win over Luthez. I was a young teen back then and wrote a letter to Mushnick addressed to Kiel Auditorium. He wrote me back for alerting him and thanked me. That was the start of an exchange of letters off and on through the years, the last letter being some 18 months ago. When I was in the army, stationed in Germany, this kind man would send me the St. Louis programs with his letters. Sam Mushnick was the National Wrestling Alliance. The road of being the head of a group of promoters like this was not always very easy. The NWA nearly died in 1961. Fred Kohler of Chicago actually called a meeting to dissolve the NWA. It was the driving force of Mushnick that united the forces together to abort this attempted move by Kohler. On a visit to Sam's office in the 1970s, he had a very interesting version of a database system. They were 3x5 index cards. Every wrestler who worked for him, every date they worked, who they worked against, and the result of the match. All previous matches and results were used to promote future matches. Sam was a man that carried dignity and integrity both inside and outside of his position as the NWA president and the St. Louis promoter. The sad fact is people like him are surely lacking both in wrestling and in society in general. The passing of Burt Ray was also a sad event. Burt published a newsletter called Matt Mania in the 60s. The business was very closed in those days, but that didn't keep Burt from giving readers inside scoops. The kind of information he gave is so common today in newsletters that it would be impossible for younger readers to understand just how difficult this was. Burt was a true blue wrestling fan. He had his run-ins with various people, but his devotion to the sport was well known. The state of wrestling today is no different than in other eras. Wrestling mirrors society. For over a year, we've seen the office of the highest elected official in the U.S. become a soapbox. Mockery of religion is common today and has been picked up by the various wrestling promotions. Nothing is new. But this is a sad way to promote wrestling. I'm trying to find information on the late Donald Van Fleet and his late wife, Violet Ray. They ran a troupe of wrestlers from the late 40s through the early 80s. They were based in Jacksonville, and did fairs, carnivals and ran shows in small towns across the United States and Canada. Any input from your readers would be appreciated. Tom Burke, Springfield, Massachusetts. Nice job on the February 8th and February 15th Baba stories. Although I was never able to see their handicraft firsthand, the style of wrestling which Baba and Mushnick promoted remains my favorite. Spawned by the quick action, MTV style of near subliminal images, most matches now are a blur of senseless transitions that lack any sort of drama. I think this is especially true in WCW's small ring. It's a small wonder why the ring entrances are usually the highlight of a match, unless Mick Foley or Chris Benoit are in the ring, and storylines are needed. Time after time you write about matches that have no heat even though the wrestlers work hard. Just watching the fans at ringside at a WCW show tells me just how little they appreciate the action. I'm a fan of Sam Mushnick style wrestling mostly because I was introduced to pro wrestling in the 50s. I dropped out after seeing Pedro Martinez TV studio matches around 1960 and wasn't impressed by WWF TV, which I began watching when I moved to Maine in 1973. A combination of having great pen pals and watching audience reaction to live matches helped make up for what was sometimes terrible ring action, unless I drove up to Canada where the ring action was good. The best live match I ever saw was a 60-minute draw between Terry Funk and Leo Burke in New Brunswick for the NWA World Heavyweight title. Burke was a great worker, but he was too short and lacked charisma. He only came up to the top of Funk's shoulders. I remember watching Bob Slaughter pin Vern Gagne in Toronto. The size discrepancy was even worse than Funk Burke, but Gagne was such a smooth wrestler you knew he could beat the big guy. As for WWF versus WCW in the female department, I like the way WWF does it. They are so campy and cartoonish, even their most tasteless stuff has satire written all over it. I love the C-clamp on Mark Henry's jewels. WCW is too realistic to be fun. I know you like the Kimberly angle, but it looked too real and too ugly. Vince had a Charlie Chaplin sense of comedy. He can laugh at himself. Because he does, so do we. Bischoff does angles and acts like he means it. I believe that's called method acting. Good satire must be outrageous like Jackie Gleason or John Belushi. Vince knows every time I laugh, he laughs to the bank. Bischoff, Hogan and Nash don't get it. They're like Mel Brooks, who would have made great movies except for one thing: he thought he was a movie star and screwed up one movie after another by putting himself in them. Bischoff and his boobs need good storylines to sell the old men and the bad workers. With the talent gap nearly closed now, the WCW is really going to start falling behind. A major error, as you've noted, is the misuse of Goldberg. In my opinion, he has a very unique personality and is not an Austin wannabe. Michael Abbey. Fairfield, Maine. This is the end of this program. See you next time.